Order the meeting of the San Ramon Planning Commission for Tuesday, April 16th, 2024. Can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Ahmed, Commissioner Alpert,
Here.
Commissioner Curtis, Vice Chair Kuznick. I'm here. And Chair Wallace.
I'm here. Mr. Barr, let's loosen up the vocal cords and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Item number 4 is public comment. Public comment being limited to matters that are not on the agenda for tonight. If anybody wishes to speak on public comment tonight who is physically present, please fill out a speaker card. We will not send it to the FBI, but leave it with the recording secretary. Do we have any written communications?
Yes, written public comment was received from Susie Ferris Indercombe, Jim Blickenstaff, and Byron Day Arcall, and it's part of the public record and was provided to the commission prior to the meeting.
Okay. Do we have any speaker cards?
No speaker cards at this time.
Okay, let me close public comment, item number 4. Item number 5 is additions and revisions to the agenda. We have none. Item 6, consent calendar. We have no items on consent calendar. Item 7, approval of the minutes from the April 2, 2024 regular meeting. Do we have any commissioner comments, questions, or changes? Or motions to approve?
I'll make a second.
Okay. Okay. Motion's been made to approve the minutes. It's been seconded. We all vote. And the minutes are approved 5-0. Thank you. Item number 8, continued items after closing a public hearing. There are none. Item number 9, continued items. There are none. Item number 10, public hearing tonight on the Bishop Ranch 15 parking reduction and medical services request. We have a staff report.
I believe it's on now. So tonight we will be discussing a proposed land change and parking reduction at Bishop Ranch 15. Bishop Ranch 15 is located at 12647 through 12677 Alcosta Boulevard. The general plan designation is downtown mixed use north, and the zoning district is downtown mixed use north within the height overlay. BR 15 is bordered by Park Central Residences to the north, Iron Horse Middle School to the south, the San Ramon Regional Medical Center to the east, and Bishop Ranch offices to the west. Bishop Ranch 15 was originally approved in 1987 and consists of 4 office buildings of approximately 792,000 square feet. It was approved with 2,262 parking spaces, including 725 land bank spaces. And so the applicant is requesting approval of 2 land use permit applications, including an umbrella minor use permit application to establish medical services, clinic, lab, urgent care use within 2 existing buildings up to approximately 396,000 square feet, and a use permit for an on-site parking reduction of approximately 38%. Please note that there was an error in the staff report that called out 34%, and that will be revised prior to signatures. And so regarding land use, BR 15 is currently occupied by office administrative, medical services, clinic, lab, urgent care, and an eating and drinking establishment with approximately 57% vacancy. And the umbrella minor use permit would increase the proposed allowable medical services land use up to 396,000 square feet, resulting in the land use allocation that you see there. And the umbrella aspect of the minor use permit would eliminate the need for individual doctors and medical uses to apply for a minor use permit. They would be recognized as a permitted use. And so here we have a parking table demonstrating the resulting parking deficit based on the proposed allocation of uses and parking required per the zoning ordinance. Based on the parking analysis, 2,234 spaces are provided on site, where 3,611 spaces are required, resulting in a deficit of 1,377 spaces, or approximately 38%. And please note that BR 15 has an existing deficit of 993 spaces, so that would be an increase in about 384 spaces. And so the applicant has provided a parking study that was conducted in September of 2023 that concluded that BR 15 would have an excess of 255 parking spaces during the peak parking demand. The applicant also provided a focused traffic impact study that evaluated the project and concluded that the conversion to medical services use would not have an adverse impact on the local roadway network, and that the addition of traffic can be accommodated without any roadway improvements. The city traffic engineers, in support of the parking study methodology and the results of the focused traffic impact study. The applicant will continue to monitor parking demand and, per the conditions of approval, will provide parking studies when medical services land uses occupied 50%, 75%, and 100% of the available tenant space. In addition, the 725 parking spaces are land banked, and should there be a demonstrated demand, the applicant would need to submit an application for approval of the land bank spaces, and the location and design would be determined at that time. And so with that, staff recommends that the Planning Commission open the public hearing and, if appropriate, adopt the Planning Commission Resolution 0124. The applicant is available for questions. And that concludes my presentation.
My suggestion would be that we let the applicant make a presentation. Staff is going to stick around for a while. And we can then ask questions at that time.
I don't believe the applicant has prepared a presentation, but they are here if you have questions for them.
I'm sorry, the applicant?
Has not prepared a presentation, but they are available for questions.
Ms. Hill, I can't imagine you gave up an opportunity to address us, but so be it. All right. I am sure that there might be some questions for you, so you might want to stick around too. All right, commissioners, let's tee it up. Who wants to go first? Mr. Alpert.
Sure. I have questions in two areas. One is related to parking. Could you explain what land bank 725 spaces actually means? Because I'm not sure I've ever been around when we've done something like that. You know, could you just kind of, for all of us, explain what that means?
So previously, the Planning Commission agreed upon land banking or deferring the 722 parking spaces, and the applicant is to submit parking studies demonstrating the need for the additional spaces, and then would work with the city to figure out where the appropriate location.
Okay, okay. And it was a condition of approval when the BR 15 was originally approved.
Yes.
Is there anything in there that's relevant for us to know about tonight about the terms of that, or does it stay in effect as is, or will it be modified as part of this project? I guess that's two questions.
It is stated quite straightforward, and just that they would need to submit studies demonstrating the need. And we don't have the location at.
Okay,
It's
so the
never
concept is
decided.
if they need it, then they have to figure out where to put it. Is that kind of the?
Yes, they would need to propose a location and then most likely submit for an application like a development plan amendment
Okay.
that would be reviewed by staff.
Okay, okay, thanks. The parking study, this next was the parking study that was conducted. It was done in September of 2023, is that right? Is there any data pre-COVID when the buildings were more full that would help us understand? September, it feels like people really aren't fully back at work. So I was just wondering if there's any data that would kind of help us feel comfortable that September is a good snapshot of what the parking lot will look like? You know?
Not sure if the applicant can speak to that.
Good evening. In response to your question, no, we don't have prior traffic studies or parking studies for this property in advance of September of 2023. What I can say and what we've all seen is that in post-pandemic, the nature of parking has changed as it relates to both office as well as medical uses. With medical uses, we're seeing more teledoctor and kind of virtual meetings and appointments with patients. And with office uses, we are seeing flexible schedules where people have hybrid work schedules where they don't need to be in the office every day. We do have prior parking studies elsewhere within Bishop Branch prior to the pandemic, but not specifically for this property.
And I guess the 25, 50, 75% studies will catch something before it becomes a problem. Is that the theory there?
That's our intention, that we'll continue monitoring and ultimately, if we do run into an issue, it will be our tenants who are coming to us as the property owner and landlord saying, we don't have anywhere to park. And so we will try to stay ahead of it so that we don't run into an issue where we've run out of parking spaces.
Okay, and that makes sense. Chair, I have questions on land use, but there might be other questions related to parking and traffic that maybe we should hit that in total first.
No, let's do it now. I mean.
Yeah, if any of my fellow commissioners want to ask questions about that, then I'll stop my questions because my other ones are not related to parking.
Okay, if you want to defer right now, that's fine.
Yeah, I'd rather stay on one topic first until we get through it. Yeah.
Okay, just add a warning that I have questions that relate not to
I do
traffic
too.
yet. So-
I do too. I was gonna wait and hit all the parking ones first. That was my suggestion, but I'm okay either way.
Commissioner Curtis.
I just had a quick question. So obviously the study is looking at current and there was 3 accidents that they looked at in terms of the collisions in that area. But that had nothing to do with all the new housing development is there. So how do they account for all the new housing that's going to bring in the traffic in that same area to make sure that it's not going to create some type of impact on the roadways once City Walk is built and all the other housing in that area going up and down Norris and Alcosta? Because it doesn't account for that now. Obviously, you can't project. I mean, I guess you could, but it didn't project. It only looked at past. So how does it account for all the new build around there? And I mean, North Canyon is, only a couple lanes wide comparative to Crow Canyon and Bollinger, but that's where everything is going to kind of be going at this point.
I think part of those concerns would be addressed when they submit for the additional parking studies with the increase in medical office use.
But at that point, wouldn't it be too late then? Because then are you going to have to look at doing something to the roadway?
Well,
I'm just asking a question because of the build. So
I mean, I'll defer to the traffic engineer at some point, but my take on it is that there actually is a background analysis and baseline conditions that look at build out assumptions over time. So for example, Summerhill, which is a residential project that's going in, actually is the baseline from years ago was the office building that goes in there. So it wasn't a net increase of 100%. It's the adjustment between the two. And so when we look at modeling over time, we look at horizon years and how that works, and that deals with the capacity issues on the roads. And so if the parking projections, also I would mention that this looks at build out in its entirety. So it's all as if every square footage of medical office was occupied. And in that situation, it didn't warrant any improvements. And so all those other projects in the area are addressed through the city's EIR process for the general plan, as well as project-specific analysis. Summerhill did that, and all the projects that come in after will have to look at their impacts and whether they trigger any requirements.
yeah, no, I understand that that's sort of what the study did. I'm just
Right.
saying, at what point then do we say that North Canyon is going to be a throughway between you have Iron Horse Village, you have City Walk, and you put this in there in the expansion? I'm just wondering if there's a way for them to understand what kind of projections that could, I mean, yeah, we had 3 collisions, but let's say that gets up to 10 collisions all of a sudden. Is that point then what do they do? I mean, what's the recourse at that point is what I'm trying to find out.
Maybe I could defer to the traffic engineer on this one.
Thank you.
Evening. So as Lauren was saying, the traffic study covers future traffic and conditions, and we take a good look at that, as far as capacity and what the roadway looks like. If something happens in the future where we do start seeing more collisions, then we look at that and we can make improvements at that time.
So we're reactive is what I'm hearing, as opposed to trying to figure out if we need to be proactive. That's my big question, is because, I mean, obviously we look at roadways, Crow Canyon being an example, and how long that's been going under construction. And so if all of a sudden we have all these new families here, and then we have to do something with Norris Canyon that could impact their quality of life and so forth. So I'm just trying to figure out how that all that works.
So we are being proactive in doing the traffic studies.
Right.
So, and, we can only, our crystal ball only goes so far. But, there are sometimes there are things that are there that we don't see or come up that we don't see, that yes, we do have to be reactive to them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, left side of the table. Mr. Ahmed.
So we already have urgent care there, right? John Muir Urgent Care. The same location we're talking about?
No.
Okay.
No, John Muir is currently located at Bishop Ranch 7.
Could you speak up? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Sorry, John Muir is located at a separate campus within Bishop Ranch.
I have a couple of questions. Going back to this issue of the applicant will provide parking studies when medical services land use occupies 50%, 75%, and then 100%. So what isn't described here is how is this monitored? Who is responsible for saying, yep, we're at 50%? And who then is looking at this with some, there's nothing that really expresses what the outcome of these additional studies are. And there's nothing specified about if in fact your parking is inadequate at 50%, then what? I think that's the question. The way I read this, it doesn't say what the then what is that we're being asked to agree to, if at 50%, at 75%, at 100%.
I think, well, when they do submit for the parking study, that would be reviewed by the city traffic engineer, and it depends on the results of the study. And that has not been determined yet, like what happens at those markers.
What would be the hypothetical options, I guess maybe is a better question to ask.
There's a couple of possibilities that it could, when you talk land bank, in several cases throughout the city and other parts of Bishop Ranch, there have been options to build parking structures in the future, right, go vertical as a way of dealing with it. There's other traffic management programs that can be put in place, valet parking. You see that sometimes at Kaiser facilities in other cities. So there's a number of remedies depending on the severity of the shortage. You can deal with the different techniques, and those would be recommendations based on the traffic study. And just a point of clarification also, as new uses come in, staff reviews those through both business licensing and building permits and tenant improvements. And so we verify zoning and enforcement of conditions that are applicable to the property. So we would be the ones responsible for ensuring that that analysis is done at those trigger points.
Okay. That's helpful. Back to the comparison with Bishop Branch 11, which is currently medical office use or medical. Is that currently under the restriction of the 1 to 200 parking designations? When we made that comparison to peak times and so forth for medical services, city parking standard as cited on page 10 of the packet.
Bishop Branch 11 was used as an example because it's predominantly occupied by medical services use. So it would be subject to the same parking ratio as BR 15 medical use.
So I just want to make sure that we are in fact comparing medical office uses with medical office uses, parking for medical office with parking with medical offices. Okay,
Correct.
you're nodding your head. Correct. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. And I also had some concerns about this issue of City Village and additional traffic, which sounds like we're perhaps going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit.
Well, but if we're going to talk about parking or traffic, you bring it up now, if you can.
Well, I just wanted to, I had a similar kind of concern about the issue of, particularly as City Village's first one's going to come online for housing. And most likely, as you are moving children to and from schools and so forth, the additional traffic on North Canyon, Alcosta. And I just wanted to feel like making sure that the traffic study had accounted for that. And right now you're asking us to just believe you did. Because you said so.
Well, I mean, the analysis is done based on the project that's before us and based on the known conditions that exist in the field. And so we have information about developments that are occurring at Summerhill. We have development potential that's spelled out in the general plan and analyzed through the general plan EIR.
Mhm.
And so each analysis that comes in year over year builds on those prior analysis and is a way of understanding what the conditions are. You can speculate to a point based on the general plan what development will occur in the future. Then in addition, roadway capacity, VMT, all those things are part of that analysis that looks at how the network of streets will evolve over time. And then also there's it ties into our CIP programs and our roadway improvement programs to deal with those types of impacts. In the event that there are issues, one option available is efficiencies and signal timing and other improvements that way. And those are all recommendations that come into play when a project is subject to review and conditioning. So the next housing project may have to do some intersection improvements. We're not sure.
Okay.
But right now, it based on the study, it's acceptable.
Well, I think I'm concerned or perhaps offering a comparison to when we looked at Iron Horse Village, there, the right in, right out only at their driveway, because it was so close to the Iron Horse Trail and the signal light at the trail, that this business entrance and exit, which you indicated in your documents here, will be the primary one across from Central Park housing. So that is for me, I'm wondering if that might be something that we need to look at.
The traffic study actually acknowledged the queuing of vehicles leaving the site. And there are actually 4 access points to this property, I believe. Is that right, 4? So there's basically the ability to spread the traffic around as needed. And some of that's, people's behavior. They modify it as they learn how to navigate areas. If there's a problem with one intersection, they'll go to the other one.
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, I had a couple of questions. The first question is one of the safety valves, in fact, the safety valve for parking study. Parking study is the land banking that was identified in the resolution 09-96. My first question is, why wasn't that resolution attached to the paperwork so we could see exactly what that land banking consisted of?
We can provide it.
I'm sorry?
We can provide it to you.
Okay. But it's not here tonight, is it?
No, it is not.
Okay. But so you're asking us to make a decision based on material that's not in front of us? That's a yes or no answer.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the condition is only for land banking. There's not an actual design.
Well,
It's based on the capacity of future parking.
Okay, I don't know what that resolution says because it wasn't provided. And I went on the website, the city website today to try and find it. I couldn't find it there either. And so since this is one of the key parts to the traffic portion, I think it's, incumbent upon staff to provide us with that information for this meeting, which it hasn't done. So that's one point that I want to raise at this point. Second point, the traffic studies you did were based on 1 day worth of counting vehicles in that parking lot. Is that correct? Plus the one over at BR 11, which is where John Muir Urgent Care is. Am I right? Okay. Now, the basis for the conclusion that there's enough spaces to provide for the anticipated patronage of that subject is based on the fact that current employers in the future will basically have the same type of employee traffic patterns as they do now?
Right now, we can only base the patterns on what we know to be
Okay.
in place. We cannot speculate on what might happen in the future.
That's not exactly a speculation. That's sort of a guess. Now, the reason I bring this up is that I think it's been fairly well established that post-pandemic, that there still is a ability of employees to work remotely from home. And so that the participation in the office is below what it was pre-pandemic. The literature has been fairly significant that employers are trying to reverse that trend and get people to have their seats in the offices. So the question is whether there's an opinion as to whether that trend is likely to continue, or is we now in a stage that forevermore the traffic patterns you see for BR 15 are going to remain the same. I mean, you're assuming that's the case, is it not? That's an assumption you're making, is that the traffic patterns will remain the same, or the parking will remain the same?
The assumption is that the patterns, based on the patterns that we know are in existence today. Part of the reason why we put in conditions for check-ins at these different percentages of occupancy is to deal with the uncertainty of these particular assumptions. I don't know if people are going to ban back to, people coming back to the office 100%, whether the trend continues. All I know is that currently there's been a change in office dynamics. Sunset can speak better than I can in terms of what the projections for office occupancy will be in the future. But again, we're looking at balancing what we believe to be an adequate parking demand, as well as what the trends are currently showing us, and providing a safety net of verifying parking in the future so that we don't have problems. Ultimately, the requirement to solve these problems is going to fall to Sunset and Bishop Ranch, because they're the ones that are negatively impacted by this. And they have an obligation to their tenants to solve these problems in
Well,
advance.
Okay, so the answer to my question is yes, we're assuming that the current patterns will continue in the future.
Based on
Fair.
what we know right now.
Okay, fair enough. So according to the traffic studies, we have a fudge factor of about 225 parking spots. That's if all the stars line up and everybody does what they're supposed to do, there'll be an excess of roughly 225. Now, my question is, let's assume we're wrong. First of all, let me go back. For the two buildings that you want to use medical services in, if Amazon came to you and said, gee, we'd like to take over the 5th floor of the 4th building, one closest to Crow, could they do that? Could you lease it to them? Yes. Okay, now, let's assume for the sake of discussion that you do that for Jeff Bezos. What does that do to the traffic studies? Does that reduce or increase traffic compared to if it was done for medical reasons? In other words, does the parking count go up or down or stay sideways? Come on down.
I will say it depends, but I'll defer to,
You've been hanging around lawyers too long, Lauren.
yeah, I know.
Yes, it does depend. However, office use generally has a lower trip generation rate than medical use. And the traffic study uses trip generation rates.
Mhm.
And which most of those rates are based off of pre-pandemic traffic patterns. So traffic wise, it's studying what the impact is based on, studies before. The background traffic is a little bit different, but however, we have noticed that traffic volumes are almost back to pre-pandemic levels. I think they're like 5% less than pre-pandemic levels. So we got the traffic. The parking studies, what they're doing, like with the medical office, the medical offices are fully functioning. They're not like pandemic, a lot less customers going there or patients. They're functioning how they should. So, what they're basing their parking rates off of are realistic. I don't think that those rates are going to change because all the doctors and all the medical people are there. If anything, they might, continue to decrease the number of people coming into the office because of the, video calls and the phone calls and the offsite ideas like that, and believe me, I look at this stuff, and I go through it with a fine tooth comb because I need it to make sense to me too.
Okay, so the bottom line, fair to say, is that you think that even if some of the space in the 2 buildings in question remained as office instead of medical services, that there would be sufficient parking on site to accommodate the patrons?
Yes,
Okay.
because the parking rate for office is less than the parking rate for medical.
Okay, now, I want you to stay up there. Let's assume for the sake of discussion that we're wrong, that we have more people wanting to use the facilities than the parking spots would allow, which on the one hand would make certain people happy. So what is at that point, it's not simply a Sunset problem, it's also a city problem because those people have to go somewhere. They're going to find someplace else to go to park if they have a doctor appointment or if they have to go to work at Amazon. So what means does the city have at that point to make sure that we don't have a mess like we have in some places in the residential areas up by the high school that we did at one time? What are our options at that point?
That's a great question.
Well, again, we have conditions for check-ins. We have land banking requirements. They can do off-site parking. They can do valet parking. There's 2,600. You could run shuttles. There's any number of possibilities of things that can be required to solve a problem that becomes a systemic problem. I mean, again, there can be isolated incidents where somebody has a hard time parking. It does happen. But currently, based on the analysis shown in this study, the likelihood of that is not high at this point. It could change, like you said, but again, we're looking at uses that are compatible with each other in terms of the timeframes and the amount of time that people spend on site. Medical uses, people come and go. And so there's a peak use ability to recognize that trend.
Well, the terms of peak use is between 8 and 5 because people go to their doctor between 8 and 5 are leaving out emergency rooms. So that's pretty much the same time frame as for offices, just that typically, because when people go to work, they tend to stay there longer. There is a definite peak of admission and leaving the building, 8 to 10 in the morning and 4 to 6 in the afternoon. That's definitely a spike. That's pretty typical of office businesses.
Sure. Can I jump in real quick? The 50% study, and I was just doing a little bit of arithmetic. At the 50% study on medical, the parking for the building, if assuming everything else is the same, is around 2,600 parking spaces. So that seems like having that 50% checkpoint would give the city ample opportunity to work with Sunset to address the parking problem. You know,
Well-
because if everybody parks like they're supposed to,
Yeah.
1 per 250, 1 per 200, and at 50% of 396, that's instead of 1,980 parking places, it's 990. So you have, and then you add it all up, it's 2621, which I realize is a little bit more than the 2234, but still less than what they've already got permission to land bank. So that feels like, or it should feel like there's time to react if that trend continues once it hits that 50% study. And to Commissioner Kuznick's question and then Lauren's response, then it sounds like Sunset would then have to go to work thinking about this, you know, whether it's start designing a garage or start letting people, you know, valet parking like they did to me at AT&T for years, you know, but there's options at that point.
No, I'm not saying there's not options. The question is what tools the city has to make sure those options are picked so we don't have a traffic problem. So, one or two more questions. As I understand the traffic study, it's basically that you're forecasting that about a third of the traffic that's going to the medical office buildings would come off of Norris Canyon Road? Yes,
I
the answer is
believe that was
yes.
the
Okay. And what was that based on?
Just travel patterns in the area. The original study had it, had the traffic distributed evenly amongst the 5 access points. And, you know, I said, that's not really realistic. So we went with, the 33% or, you know, I don't remember the exact percentage at the Norris driveway, just because of the ease of access to some of the other driveways. You know, like if you're coming down El Costa, you're going to take the El Costa driveway. If you're in, you know, like on Camino Ramon, you might take Executive Parkway. It's sort of, you know, just a scientific guess. You know,
I like that. I appreciate the guess part. That's okay.
you know, I mean, it's an art more than it is a science.
Yeah.
And this is just based on, you know, my long, tenure in this business.
Yeah, no, I agree with your comment that it's more of an art than a science about this. The reason I brought it up was because having driven around there, you know, most of the population of the city is south of BR 15. Like when I come to BR 15, I go down Bollinger and then go down Acosta. And rather than going all the way down Norris, waiting for a traffic light and going down, making a light and then going around the building, you know, I'd probably take that first exit, which is a turn lane off of Acosta on Executive Parkway. People from the north area, if they come down Crow, if it ever gets finished, and turn on El Costa, they'd probably go into the main entrance, and they could come over because you're right in the middle of the parking lot. But that's why I asked, you know, where you came up with the 33%. Okay,
Yeah, I was trying to maximize that particular intersection to see what the impacts would be.
my last question is this. Of the 350 pages, it seemed like 300 was roughly collision reports. And I am curious as to why you had collision reports dealing with accidents on San Ramon Valley Boulevard and places like that.
That was the consultant's
Okay.
appendix. I had nothing to do with that.
Okay, disclaimer duly noted. Thank you. Thank you. You might want to hang around for a little longer, not necessarily at the podium. So let's go back, and I think you wanted to talk about a different subject on this particular project.
I did, land use. First of all, there's a term that I'm not sure I'm familiar with, an umbrella use permit. Could you explain what that means?
So opposed to individual doctors or medical uses coming into Bishop Ranch 15 and wanting to occupy a tenant space, without the umbrella, they would need to apply for individual minor use permits to allow that use. With the umbrella minor use permit, we're allowing it within those two existing buildings. So if a doctor goes and wants to apply for a business license in one of those two buildings, and if this umbrella minor use permit is approved, then we can sign off on their business license without having them go through the permit process before.
Okay, okay. And so that makes sense. Thank you. So I was looking at the zoning code table 2.8, which I think is the right one, because it has permit required by zone. And I think we read that it's being submitted and processed under OA as opposed to DMU North because of the timing that it was submitted. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, so in the table, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 medical services. Medical services, clinic, lab, ground floor, medical services, clinic, upper floor, and then it has 2 medical services, doctor's office. And under the doctor's office column, the little row and cell, it's P, which is a permitted use today. So that means if a doctor's office wants to come in today with no other change, they're permitted and the city will process the application and give them their business license and I assume any other work the city, right?
Yes.
That's how to understand the table. And then under clinic lab, it needs a minor use permit. And so the recommendation is if it's not related to doctors because they already get the permitted, but it's under labs that we're trying to make it easier for the city, for the application to be processed. Is that correct?
Right. So if we approve the umbrella minor use permit, then that would essentially permit those
Okay.
types of businesses to go into BR 15.
So we subtracted the M and the U from the table and that's what it looks like. Okay,
Yes.
okay. And then when an applicant comes in to do something like a lab, not a doctor, the city will, what's the city's process is still to review building permits and things like that, whether it's
Yes.
permitted or minor use permit, right?
Yes, everyone would be required to have a business license. And then if they are applying for tenant improvements, then they would need to apply for the associated building permits for those improvements.
Okay, okay. Historically, do we know why it was previously a minor use permit versus permitted? What was the city when the zoning table was created attempting to watch out for?
My thought is that it would have to do with the parking requirements.
It's primarily parking and scale. Was dealing with those issues before. There is a different parking standard, but also doctors' offices are subject to the higher parking standard too. It's just if you have a concentration of doctors, I think it's 5 if I recall, that kicks it into the higher category. It becomes a clinic at that point.
Oh,
And so
okay.
so it's really just it's a question of scale and potential impact going forward to other uses on the property.
Okay, okay. And then, if somebody comes in and they want to put in, I don't know, a nuclear something or another that falls under the category of lab, would the city be able to evaluate this, that this is kind of over the line if we change it to a permitted use? I don't know I don't know the definition of lab, I guess is where my question is.
Uh,
How how egregious could a lab be for us?
I guess my question is, when you say nuclear, you're talking about something that would be a potential concern because of the
Yeah.
activities that
It
they're
was a
using
bad
there?
example. It was a terrible example. I get it. I get it. But
Okay.
some use that, and I guess I failed to look at the definition of lab versus doctor's office versus clinic, and maybe that would have helped.
Ultimately, those types of issues are occupancy type of issues in terms of what the building code requires for those types of businesses to go forward. It's not really necessarily a land use. It may be under the umbrella of laboratory, but if it's some unique category of laboratory, it'll be regulated in a different sense through building codes and occupancy standards.
Okay. I'm kind of reflecting back on City Center when, we kind of had to squeeze in, Sandbox VR into an arcade use. And I was trying to think,
Yeah.
through that kind of scenario, if there's things like that. And okay, that's kind of where my head
I
was
mean,
kind of going.
technology changes all the time, but it hasn't been an issue
Okay,
yet.
okay. And then, okay, I think those are my questions for now. Just trying to understand. Thank you for the answers and clarifying it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
All right, I had a question. Well, actually, I had more than one question. Let's start out with the low-hanging fruit. I tried to find the procedure for doing an umbrella use permit in our zoning ordinance today, and I couldn't find it. Where would it be found?
I don't believe it's.
There's actually it's a descriptor, not a defined term in our code. It's basically an authorization for up to a certain percentage of square footage,
I see.
whether it's one or multiple businesses.
Okay, so it's fair to say that there's nothing in our zoning ordinance that refers to umbrella use permit. Now, do any of our neighboring Tri-Valley cities have procedures for umbrella use permits?
I have not done that research.
Okay, now in all fairness to you, I did go on the internet today to look for descriptions of quote, umbrella use permits, close quote, and came up with nothing. So we are dealing with an attempt here for a permit that does not have any procedures in our current zoning ordinance, and B, to my knowledge, has never been used before. Now, I understand that the purpose is to basically give Sunset carte blanche to allow any medical services that they want to go into that building. But that's not what a use permit is designed to do as far as I can see. The application procedure we have, which I did pull up today, requires the applicant for a use to specify what the use is. And the point to that is though the reviewing authority, which is the Planning Commission, can determine whether that specific use is appropriate and meets the findings that are required to issue a use permit in the zoning ordinance. And to provide a blanket permission for Sunset to allow any medical facility they want in there seems to me to be completely contrary to the whole point to the zoning ordinance dealing with use permits. So what I understand is saying that Sunset doesn't want to go through the hassle of when they want a tenant to go into those buildings to provide the Planning Commission with a permit application that says, here's what we want this person to do in our building, and here's why it's consistent with our zoning ordinance and the area around it. I don't think that for a 400,000 square feet of space in two separate buildings, that type of carte blanche approach is appropriate. So tell me why I'm wrong.
The nature of the land use is well defined. The concerns that we particularly have with these types of uses relate primarily to parking issues. And so the ability to check these uses as they come in under, whether you call it an umbrella permit or a use permit that allows square footage up to a certain point, is sort of irrelevant in this case. You could strike out the term umbrella if you like, but the idea is that we understand what the impacts are of the total square footage of this use. And if it's acceptable, we can regulate it through the ministerial process that we have related to building permits, zone clearances, and or just business license zone clearance. And so it's a check, there are checks and balances in this process. Again, the nature and the definition of medical office uses is defined, and we can review against those standards, as can you.
Well, that's the point. When a medical business proposes to come into a building and needs a permit, it has to tell us what they're going to do and why they're going to do it, so we can determine whether that's an appropriate use within the zoning ordinance. If
Well-
we give carte blanche to Sunset to allow them to make that decision, we don't have a use permit process at all. Wouldn't that apply to any office building as well? We give a umbrella permit for an office building and said, as long as it meets the definition of office use, hey, you can rent to whoever you want. You don't need a use permit, even though that's what the zoning ordinance says.
Well, office uses don't need a use permit. And essentially that is the case for office uses. They are not controversial. The buildings are designed to accommodate that. In this case, they're demonstrating that the building is suitable to accommodate the medical uses as defined by our code, as defined by the parking standards, and based on a traffic analysis. And so, again, it's not that they have carte blanche to do this. There are basically checks and balances in place through the permitting process. I would also add that minor use permits aren't necessarily brought to the Planning Commission on all cases. This is a bigger project that required parking reductions. That's why it's before you. Otherwise, it is a ZA determination for minor use permits. So again, there's a process in place to verify that it's consistent with the operating constraints that you're reviewing tonight.
Well, if that were the case, if the zoning administrator wants to review all these minor use permits, I suppose that's the ZA's prerogative. But in that case, there is a reviewing authority that reviews each of these individual applications to determine whether it is appropriate or not. There is a review.
There-
Now, but you talked about building permits. Building permits are designed to make sure that the building is consistent with our codes.
Also, planning reviews every building permit issued in the city.
Okay, and
And we review it for compliance with zoning standards and city standards. And in the case of a use permit, every permit that comes in that's under the authorization of a use permit is verified by planning staff for consistency with the conditions of approval.
well, I understand that, but your answer assumes that there's a permit that's issued with conditions of approval. If that happens, then clearly staff can look at the use permit, compare it to what the applicant wants to do, and see if they line up. But we're talking about a use that's never been determined. This is an ab initio determination that this, according to the zoning ordinance, is supposed to be made by the reviewing authority.
There's not, this use has been approved all over the city in terms of medical uses. If you're referring to the idea of an umbrella permit, again, the term umbrella is irrelevant. You're approving a use permit for the purposes of medical office, or excuse me, medical clinic uses. And that's something that can be approved under the conditions of this use permit that would be applicable to every business that comes in the future under this use permit for review by city staff and the building department.
Then why don't we have the text of the use permit that we're proposed to approve?
You-
Why isn't that part of the package along with the
You
resolution?
have a resolution with the use permit. The resolution is the use permit. You're approving the use permit application filed by Sunset Development.
Which we haven't seen.
You have seen. This is the application before you tonight. Are you referring to the land bank provision?
Oh, that's a separate issue. That's a
Well-
separate issue. That's a separate issue.
The resolution is authorizing the land use permit that's before you. Yeah. Sorry, say that again? That's the conditions, but the land use permit is the resolution that's in front of you.
Mhm. That's all the questions I have. Did anybody else have any other questions?
I just wanted to make sure I understood one thing. So the lab definition is, I found it in the glossary. I apologize. I didn't read it before. So that's not changing, right? That's, so if the use comes in and it meets whatever the lab says here, the definition, that's kind of the way staff will look at it to see if it's allowed. Is that right?
Correct.
And then, and I think I get that really we're proposing or requesting or asked to evaluate a change to the zoning, the allowable use table from minor use permit to permitted,
Not as part of this action.
not a part of this one. So the umbrella minor use permit is approved, but we're not changing the permitted use.
If
That's
you
what
like to
confused.
strike umbrella use
Yeah.
permit, that's fine, and just substitute it for minor use permit. That's, or use permit, whatever the category is. Umbrella is a descriptor that we're using
Okay.
to recognize the fact that there are multiple businesses going in under this use
Okay.
permit.
I-
If that's confusing the issue,
Oh.
it does not need to be there.
Okay, no, I'm okay with that part. I thought I understood what we were doing for a while ago, because I thought under the column called OA and the uses, today it's MUP and in the future it would be P, because it's permitted. Is that's
it-
not true? That's not true. Yeah,
Well, in the
it's-
future, correct me if I'm wrong, it does go permitted in the future. Right? For minor, sorry, Cindy.
Just trying to keep it simple in my own head. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Through the chair. So we are in the process of updating our zoning ordinance, and we are taking a look at all of the different allowable uses in all of the existing and the new land uses that were created, the zoning categories that were created in this last general plan zoning ordinance update. There are already established land uses that are allowed in the table. We're not proposing a text amendment to the zoning ordinance as part of this application. The action would only allow for medical office clinics at the two buildings in Bishop Ranch 15 only. So the action would only impact these two buildings
Okay.
and the allowable doctors that are going into this building. When we bring back the zoning ordinance update, you'll probably see updated definitions of different types of land uses that we've been reviewing since the last time we revisited the land use tables. Our research has found that Saramone is one of the only cities that regulates 5 or more practitioners. And we're the only ones that really make a distinction between if an office is 4 versus 5. And our past practice has shown us that whether you have 4 doctors, 5 doctors, the medical offices generally operate the same.
Okay.
So I expect that when you get that zoning ordinance text amendment in front of you, you'll probably see some new definitions that align with
Okay.
our research and current practice of the businesses. I can't guarantee exactly how that definition will change, but we're not proposing a change to the text amendment tonight
Okay.
to the zoning ordinance,
Okay.
only just to allow these 2 buildings in Bishop Ranch to have the use permit applied to all floors rather than an individual suite.
Okay. I think I get it. I think I get it, Okay. I think I'm okay now.
Okay, anybody else want to have a discussion?
I just have a quick question about the resolution, because you said that it's actually proposes a 38% parking reduction.
Yes.
The resolution says 34%. So are we actually going to be voting on one that has an incorrect percentage on there, or should we be? Is there some type of amendment that we go on here? Because right now it says 34%. I just want to make sure that we're voting on the right resolution.
We would recommend you amend it to 38.
Okay.
Yes.
We'd have to make the amendment. Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Appreciate it.
Okay, so here's the point. Do you want to go through the resolution and the conditions of approval? I see at least one person two people got the heads up and down. All right. All right, let's look at the first page of the resolution. Anybody have any comments?
The only change would have to be the amendment to as the 34% has to be 38% on the second to last line where it says, whereas the project proposes 34% parking reduction for Bishop Branch 15, it should be 38%.
Through the chair, this is a public hearing. We haven't opened
Good
a public
point.
hearing.
Good point. Okay, fair enough. Thank you. So this is a public hearing. So let me open the public comment section. Do we have any written communications?
No written communications and no speaker cards.
Okay, do we have any speaker cards?
Sorry. Oh, sorry. That's correct.
No speaker cards.
Okay. Now, does anybody want to come down and talk to us? Even if they haven't submitted a speaker card yet, you can do it afterwards. I don't see any heads going up and down. So going once, going twice, public comments closed. Okay. So let's go on to the resolution. So far, Commissioner Curtis has pointed out that we need to change the parking reduction figure from 34 to 38%, correct?
Correct.
Okay, I do. I want to note for the record that I disagree with the condition that talks about resolution 09-96 because we have not been given a copy of that. I don't know what it says or how it applies. And I can't therefore in good conscience say that that's part of the approval process.
Special conditions.
Yeah. Okay.
What does that mean? Are we not gonna approve this special now? Or you never?
Well, let's go through it and then probably at the end I'll tell you. Well, I will tell you one way or the other. Okay. Page 2, does anybody have any comments, changes?
Again, on the bottom, section, was it number 1, letter B has the proposed 34%. Again, it should be 38%. The very last line.
Anybody else? I have an objection on the whereas paragraph, and I want to make my objection specific. Where it says the proposed project with the use permit application is consistent with the requirements of section D6-28 use permits. I disagree. I can't make a finding on that because that section clearly applies to individual uses of the property. It is antithetical in my view to a hypothetical umbrella use permit application, something we don't have in our zoning code right now. So I would object to that statement as being inapplicable and incorrect.
So are you suggesting that simply we eliminate the word umbrella?
No, I don't think that based on my reading of the zoning ordinance that we can give a carte blanche approval on a permit to a project we've never seen before. That the whole point to the zoning ordinance when it deals with use permits is there has to be a specific use that is brought to the attention of the reviewing authority. It says, here's what we propose to do. Please give us permission. And I don't see how that you can have a blanket permission for a category of uses without knowing what each of those uses is. I don't believe that we have the ability to do what is essentially an umbrella permit, carte blanche. So I object to that as a finding of the planning commission on that level. I also disagree with sub-finding 1B that goes over to page 3 for the same reason. Let's go on to page 3. Does anybody have any comments on page 3? Okay, I do. I have an objection. Again, I'm going to be specific to paragraph C, D, and E because it is not possible to determine whether a use permit is consistent without knowing what the use is going to be made of that particular property. I don't believe an umbrella use permit is permitted under our zoning ordinance. Page 4.
Explain if a use comes in and it meets the definition of medical lab. You made the comment that we don't know what the use would be. Could you, it feels like if it's comes in and staff identifies it as medical use, clinic, lab, whatever the other word was. Do you still feel that we don't know what the future use is? Is that where your concern is? Ignore the word umbrella for a second, just that, you know. And I think what I took from Cindy was, no, we're not amending the text of the zoning table, but for these two buildings, you might as well, in my mind, I'm thinking it is permitted for these two buildings. And so if someone comes in, meets the definition of medical services lab, which could be a 5-doctor office or a lab as defined in the zoning code, that is the use permit that's being proposed. So could you explain where your concern are? I'm not following it totally. You know?
Sure. What does the clinic do? What exactly does the clinic do? I think that when you're doing a use permit, you have to know what the business consists of, what it's going to do. It might make a difference if they were doing nuclear testing, nuclear medicine. I don't know. But the point is that there has to be some specificity as to what the use is in order to grant a use permit. I mean, look at all the use permits we did for the kids childcare centers. We wanted to know how many kids there were going to be, how big the playground was going to be, all that type of stuff before we grant a use permit.
But through the chair, you have a capacity that has been identified here, similar to what you would do with a childcare center and an operator. You have a use that's been identified based on the definitions in the unit zoning ordinance and the definitions in code. So to say that there isn't a defined use is not really correct. They are defined by the categories that have been adopted by the city. And again, the limits that are being put in place are based on the proposal before you tonight in terms of square footage, addressing parking concerns and everything else. So again, you know what the uses are going in. You don't know a business name, but that's not always typical of a use permit anyway. You wouldn't necessarily know who the end operator is going to be. And so again, it seems like that there's a difference of opinion in terms of how a use is defined. I would also add that there's no physical changes to the site plan being proposed. This is uses within an existing building. So there's no operational differences in terms of how the building is configured. You're working with that, consistent with what the building codes would allow and what the existing conditions have. So again, there's no unique characteristics of the business in terms of how it's going to fit and operate within the building.
Well, I disagree with you. I see it hard to believe that a clinic or a lab is going to have the same type of structure as an accountant's office. Right now, you have floors in those buildings that are completely vacant. They're down to the concrete floors. So something's going to have to be built on top. So it's going to be different than an office.
Yeah, but it's internal to the building
Yeah,
and it's
I agree.
subject to building codes, not discretion of the planning commission.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. The building codes should determine whether the project meets the requirements of our building codes, which I would think would be objective and therefore ministerial. So, and I don't care about the name of the business. I just want to know what they're going to do. So I understand we have a disagreement on that. So why don't we move on?
Again, business license tells us what they're going to do.
Well, telling me they're a clinic doesn't really provide much information. Anyway, let's move on. Any questions or comments on paragraph 4? Again, on subparagraph F, at the top of the page, I would disagree with that. Without knowing what type of particular use is, a use permit shouldn't be granted. Page 5, signature block. We're okay with that? Okay. All right, let's go over to conditions of approval. Page 1, anybody have any changes or corrections? Page 2. Page 3. Okay. So we've been through the resolution, we've been through the conditions of approval. Someone want to make a motion to approve resolution 01-24?
I'll
With-
go ahead and make a motion
Okay.
to approve 0-24. As amended with the changes we have made and the recognition of those that are posed.
So
Yeah.
the recommendation is to delete the whereases that are objectionable.
Recommendation is to change the language of the umbrella change of anywhere it says 34 to 38. And just to note that there were some objections to some of the whereas, and I'm not saying to delete them. I'm saying that that there were some standards that people did not agree with, but I'm not saying to delete it. I'm saying the only change, the only amendment is from 34 to 38%.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
When we have objections to a resolution, what's the practical effect? Because I'm looking at.
It comes out in the vote.
Comes out.
It'll come-
He strikes it out, or she strikes it out, or fix it.
Okay, so the short answer, and maybe the city attorney wants to weigh in after I'm finished, but basically, I've had some communications with the city attorney. This came up at a meeting last year, where it was suggested that if a commissioner objected to a resolution, that the commissioner should specify what parts of the resolution the commissioner disagreed with and the reason for that disagreement. Now, with the possible exception of housing applications, I don't believe that's correct. But as a philosophical matter, I've always felt that if you disagreed with a resolution, then you should state why, if for no other reason than to convince your fellow commissioners that you're right. So that's why I'm doing it. Now, in terms of the practical significance, I made an objection to various parts of the resolution. That's not striking the resolution. It says, I disagree with it. The resolution then goes to a vote by the commission. And if a majority of commissioners vote to approve the resolution as amended by Commissioner Curtis, raising the parking reduction from 34 to 38%, then the resolution is adopted. My objections were noted for the record, but as a legal effect, your vote to approve the resolution is the one that matters. Okay?
I'll
So-
go ahead and make a second to the resolution.
Yeah. So the motion's been made and seconded to approve resolution number 01-24 as amended by Commissioner Curtis. We have the roll call vote or have a vote. Resolution number 01-24 is approved by a vote of 4-1. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hill, for coming down. Move on to the next item on the. Sorry about that. I keep turning this off. All right. Next item on the agenda is one of our ubiquitous study sessions. This has to do with the non-retail policy. Ms. Shee, you have the floor.
Well, thank you and good evening. Just going to take a minute here to get that loaded. There is, but it's not in that traditional blue heading. You'll see it as the aerial photo as that first page. So just a quick introduction for the project, because it has been some time since we last talked about non-retail uses. And so before I invite our consultant up, I thought I'd just spend a few minutes just kind of talking about history. So as the staff report noted, the city has, since the first general plan, had a non-retail policy in our general plan that guided the percentage of non-retail uses in shopping centers. And that percentage has been specific in that policy since the city's first general plan. As part of our update to the general plan 2040, that 2-year effort that we took to update the plan, one of the policies that were identified as potentially needing a change was the policy that was specifically limiting non-retail usage to 25%. There was a series of public comments and letters that were submitted asking the Planning Commission and City Council to consider providing some alternatives and an evaluation of that policy. So in December of last year, we updated our general plan with a new policy that tasks the city with two tasks. So staff was to evaluate and update as needed the policy related to the maximum allowable percentage of non-retail uses in shopping centers. And then the second task is to adopt findings to make that determination if the percentages were to be exceeded. And that work has to be done through the zoning ordinance update. And so with the adoption in December, we've now moved into the implementation portion of our work on this non-retail policy. So in December, we received the go-ahead to have staff evaluate and analyze. As a result of that, we hired our general plan economic consultant to come back and help us with analyzing what the potential impacts of making a change to the non-retail uses in our shopping centers would do. And so that's the introduction to the Nallison Dales Group report that's attached to your staff report this evening. I will say that staff and the consultant has worked really hard to think about how we would approach this evaluation. It is not something, a model that exists anywhere in California, probably in the country, on how to best determine what percentage we go to, how do we evaluate that? And so what you're seeing is actually us inventing the wheel here on how best to practically put into numbers what the impact of increasing from what we have currently as 25% to some other number, and what that impact to sales tax might mean to retail centers. And so it's probably a future APA session, I'm sure, that we'll present it at a future conference, because was no defined way to analyze this. And so what you're seeing is our attempt to try to quantify something that up until now we weren't able to necessarily quantify. So I will say that we haven't quite moved into our second step in terms of the adoption of findings and modifying findings. We thought it would be helpful to first present the report about how we evaluated and how we analyzed the issue, and sort of come to some conclusions or some recommendations as to the percentage and if we were on the right track there, before we then moved into that second effort of trying to adopt findings. I did put in front of you, it's not in the staff report, just a copy of the section D4-38 of the zoning ordinance. In case you're interested in referencing those findings, that is in front of you. But again, we're not considering findings just yet. That's the section right now in the zoning ordinance that talks about if you were to exceed 25%, these are the things that you would have to document. That percentage that's right now listing 25%, that's the topic really this evening. What do we change that 25% to if recommended? And we'll get into findings at some point in the future in this implementation step. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Roger Dale with the Nallison Dale Group so that he can lead you through the presentation, and I'll come back up if you have other questions for me, I'm sure.
Oh, we might have one or two.
So good evening, Chair Wallace and members of the commission. I'm Roger Dale with the Nadelson Dale Group, and pleased to be back with you this evening to go over this policy dealing with the percentage of non-retail uses that the city might consider within retail shopping centers. I should mention that our firm is an economic analysis firm specializing in real estate and economic development issues. We do some work for the development community, but I would say that probably 85% of our clients are cities. So we're predominantly a public sector consultant. And when we look at these types of issues, we tend to look at it from at least three different perspectives that we try to think about how can a community balance. The first perspective is, if I'm looking at it from the perspective of if I were a resident living in this community, what types of shopping opportunities would I like to see, and what types of commercial environment would I like to see maintained in the city? I think the second perspective would be from the city's perspective of maintaining a strong fiscal base in terms of sales tax, as well as just maintaining a healthy commercial environment in terms of the investment in properties over time so that they are maintained in good condition and provide strong community gathering places. And then the third perspective would be from the perspective of a property owner. If we looked at this issue from the standpoint of a shopping center owner that's making decisions about how to invest, reinvest, or not in a property, what types of policies might most encourage that? So on the first slide here, we've kind of listed some of the reasons that the concept of diversifying a tenant mix away from the pure retail concept that has been in place historically for shopping centers. And from a shopping center owner's perspective, that might include diversifying the mix to help overcome a loss of tenants or tenant downsizing, especially in this era where that is happening a lot due to competitions from e-commerce. There are also other changes in shopping trends related to that that would tend to give newer shopping centers an advantage because they are developing from the get-go based on this new model, and they're kind of at an advantage compared to older shopping centers that may have developed under a different era. And then the issue of expectations about how a vacant space in a retail shopping center might be re-tenanted, I think need to be tempered with a recognition that in many cases, the set or the universe of prospective tenants has shrunk over time with certain retail chains affected by bankruptcies, downsizings, shrinking individual stores or closing stores, and not as aggressively pursuing new locations. So that shrinks the universe of prospective tenants from a shopping center owner's perspective. And then there's just other considerations about how do you maintain a viable shopping center in that environment? And what we've kind of looked at here is what are the potential impacts to the city from the likelihood that certain centers will experience vacancies over time, and that's always happened. But what might be new about that is that the likelihood of those vacant spaces being re-tenanted with sales tax generating tenants versus services or other things that generate less sales tax, that likelihood might be lower now. And so we're very interested in how that change might impact the city's total sales tax revenue over time. And beyond the issue of sales tax, how does that affect just the overall viability of a shopping center in terms of, is it likely to maintain an acceptable vacancy or occupancy level over time? And how does that affect decisions about reinvestment and just the overall functionality of the center, both from the owner's perspective, but from the community's perspective. As you're aware, the city's existing policy limits non-retail occupancies in shopping centers to a maximum of 25% just of the ground floor area. It doesn't apply to second floor centers that have second floors. And as I think you're also aware, in practice, many of the existing shopping centers exceed that number in San Ramon because there are certain uses that are exempt from the ceiling. They're not what we would consider retail or sales tax generating uses, but they have been kind of factored into the policy and they're exempt. And then other centers have specifically sought discretionary permits that allow them to have tenants that would cause them to exceed that cap. We have, as part of this process, gotten some very detailed data from city staff about the existing shopping centers in the city. And this chart shows for what are defined as large centers, generally over 100,000 square feet, what their existing vacancy rates are, and then where they stand currently relative to that 25% cap on non-retail uses on the ground floor. And the vacancy rate data varied, how recently that was developed varied from center to center, but generally it was early this year, so January, February. So I would say fairly recent data. These are conditions, of course, that are always in flux with any shopping center environment, but fairly recent. One notable exception there, and it's shown on the chart, is the Marketplace, which already has a very high vacancy rate of 36.1%. Has just within the last couple of weeks notified us that they're going to be losing two of their larger tenants, CVS and Firehouse 37. That's not included in that 36% factor. So if we were to add that in, I think it gets their number up to 52 or 53%. Also on the chart, you'll see that most of these larger centers do fall within the 25% limit or are very close to it. On the next page, we show smaller shopping centers, and here you'll notice a couple of things that, generally speaking, they have lower vacancy rates than the larger centers, and you also see that many of them far exceed the 25% factor. And I would suspect that those, to some extent, those two facts are related. The fact that they've been able to lease space to non-retail tenants has probably contributed to a lower vacancy rate. And to some extent, they're kind of a different nature of these centers, that they're probably more inclined to have non-retail uses because they're in some cases kind of hybrid centers that are retail, office, or other types of uses. And as noted here, many of these that exceed the 25% cap have done so with MUP or LUP permits that the city has approved and has currently in place. So we have specifically looked at two issues that we understand to be of concern to the city. First of all, if the city were to increase the limit from 25% to some higher number, how would that impact city's sales tax receipts? We know that if you replace a store that's generating, let's say, $300 a square foot in sales tax and replace that with a service type use, which on average generates maybe $20 a square foot in sales tax, there is on paper a loss of a significant amount of sales tax. However, it depends on what we compare that to. You compare the service use or the non-retail use that's generating some sales tax to an existing occupied space, definitely there's a loss. But if you compare it to a vacant space that generates no sales tax, then you kind of have to balance those conditions. And we'll talk more about this in a moment, but the other issue is that retail shopping centers are only a portion of the total sales tax revenue that the city receives, and I'll describe that more in a moment. So the second question that we looked at as part of the study is, how would changing that 25% limit to a higher number, how might that impact the goal of maintaining economically viable shopping centers? And we would define that as a center that has, first of all, does not have a high vacancy rate. And therefore, there's an ability on the ownership typically to invest in it and keep it well maintained, making it more potentially more attractive to consumers and continuing to serve as a community gathering place. And just for the sake of this analysis, we've looked at two scenarios: increasing the 25% factor to 35% or to 45%. The model that we've set up, we can test any range of numbers, but those are the two we thought would be interesting to look at for this initial discussion. Our process included several data sources that were all very useful to this larger set of questions. First of all, we looked at a database called Placer AI, which is a company that tracks people's movements based on their cell phone usage. And so they can tell us down to the address level if someone went to visit the Marketplace Shopping Center, for example, where they came from before that and where they went to afterwards. This was of interest to us because one of the, I think, arguments that a shopping center owner might make for increasing the amount of non-retail uses is that properly positioned and the right types of non-retail uses can generate a certain amount of foot traffic for a shopping center that in effect they can function like an anchor tenant would in a traditional shopping center. And we wanted to kind of look at these data from Placer AI to see if that's really playing out in the community in terms of, do we see people coming to a shopping center from a medical office that's nearby or from a educational facility, or what types of uses seem to work synergistically in terms of creating foot traffic within a shopping center. And I'll talk more about that later. We also had interviews with 3 of the major property owners, commercial property owners in San Ramon, to get their perspectives on existing vacancies in their centers, what they anticipate the future trends to be, and what their success has been in terms of recruiting new retail and restaurant uses to backfill current vacancies. As part of our modeling process, we looked not just at existing vacancies, but we made assumptions about potential future vacancies, in other words, increasing vacancies in these shopping centers and how those might be re-tenanted, and I'll describe that more in a moment. We then kind of looked at a percentage breakdown of, if you had one of the anchor tenants, for example, we know that CVS is going to be leaving the Marketplace. We know the square footage of that. And within our projections, we made assumptions that essentially half of that might be re-tenanted with non-retail uses, and the 25% might be filled with retail restaurant uses, and 25% might remain vacant, just for modeling assumptions. One of the things we discovered when we actually got into the data is that there are a number of conditions in place here that, from a practical perspective, limit the effect that changing that percentage really has on sales tax generation. And not to say that it doesn't matter, but that there are reasons that there may be more important considerations about maintaining the city's overall sales tax base. One of the issues is that, as we've noted, many of the centers already exceed the existing 25% cap. And so if you raised it to, let's say, 35%, it's really not going to make a change because a number of cases they're already at that number, so they wouldn't be going higher than where they are now. Many of the centers, and as I noted, especially the ones that have more non-retail uses, have low vacancy rates, so there's likely to be less turnover of tenants that would therefore the shopping center owner needs to make the decision between a retail or a non-retail reuse of that space. And the third point here is, in our mind, most interesting, was probably the most interesting, is that the shopping centers that we've evaluated, which are all the shopping centers in the city, currently generate only about 29% of the city's total sales tax revenue. So I guess what that tells us is that this policy of affecting the percentage of use that can be retail versus non-retail at most affects 29% of your sales tax revenues. The other sales tax revenues in San Ramon come from business to business transactions, largely in the Bishop Ranch area, and also certain standalone retail tenants that are not affected by this policy for shopping centers. And that would be gas stations, maybe a freestanding big box store like a Home Depot. Those types of things wouldn't be affected by this policy, and they account for a big amount of your sales tax. There are many centers with less than 50,000 square feet. And again, it just kind of a smaller universe of things that would turn over and affect a change. And then finally, as I noted earlier, even if a space is vacated and replaced with a service type business, it's not the case that that generates zero sales tax. It's considerably less than a traditional retail store, but it's not zero. So that to some extent mitigates the effect of these changes. On the other hand, possible downsides to continuing to restrict non-retail uses, in other words, keeping the 25% limit in place. In our projections, we're indicating that the vacancy rates in some centers would likely increase and persist. In other words, you would have more vacancies, and with less flexibility for re-tenanting shopping centers with other types of uses, we would expect some of those to persist over time. And we've made the point already, but non-retail uses with a tenant do generate some sales tax, whereas a vacant space would generate none. Over and above the consideration of sales tax, there are other downsides to that type of a condition. First of all, we would expect centers to potentially be subject to disinvestment over time, since there's really inability for less flexibility for the owners to do what the market would otherwise allow them to do. And so you can see a scenario where shopping centers would become less pleasing aesthetically, and that would kind of have a secondary impact of reduced patronage, and which kind of has a domino effect of making it even less desirable to other tenants. So that you can see vacancies kind of spiraling out of control over time under a worst case scenario. So as I've alluded to already, some of the findings here are that non-retail tenants in shopping centers can generate a significant amount of foot traffic and thereby enhance the sales performance of adjacent retail restaurant space within the same center or near to the center. And the Placer AI data that we looked at basically confirmed that assumption or that conclusion. Roughly 33%, roughly a third of people who come to visit a shopping center in San Ramon come from a non-retail type of a setting, a medical office, an educational facility, a fitness facility. And these are very consistent with the types of things that we hear from the development community in terms of the types of uses that they think represent the best investment or represent the best opportunities to maintain the value of their investments in retail shopping centers. The way we have modeled this, when you go up to a 35% or a 45% limit on non-retail uses, it has, I would say, minimal impacts on sales tax receipts. And I'll get into some of the numbers in a minute. There is some loss of sales tax revenue. That is correct. That's part of our finding, but it's not as dramatic as it might sound based on, if you went from 25% to 45%, that sounds like a significant change, and it is, but it doesn't result in that big of a change in sales tax receipts. And so we are suggesting that the city would consider a more flexible policy, in other words, higher than the 25%, that would allow retail shopping centers to respond to market trends and market needs, and most importantly, to incentivize reinvestment in shopping centers so that they are maintained as attractive, viable community places over time. On this chart, we've looked at a couple of scenarios in terms of sales tax losses. Just by way of context, in fiscal year 22-23, the shopping centers that we have evaluated, we estimate generated about $3.3 million in city sales tax revenue for that year. And we don't have access to exact data. We did review some data from HDL for a group of centers, and from that we estimated what it would be for the whole set. And I would say it was generally consistent with what we expect to see in a community of this type. So we think that's a reasonable estimate. We also know from sales tax records that the total sales tax in the city is 11.3 million during that fiscal year. So take the difference between the 3.3 that's generated by shopping centers, and that's fully 8 million comes from basically non-shopping center types of uses, or about 71%. In the middle of this chart, we look at what happens to sales tax revenues under these two scenarios. And we project under scenario one, which is the 35% ceiling, that sales tax revenue would decline by about $335,000 a year compared to the baseline numbers that we showed above. And then scenario two, which is a higher 45% limit, it's essentially the same. It's actually a little bit less. It goes down by 332,000. And it might seem counterintuitive that you're going to have less of an impact with a higher amount of non-retail. It has to do with the assumptions or the projections we've made that just because you require less, or you allow less non-retail use, doesn't mean that that's going to cause the thing to be a vacant space to be re-tenanted with a retail use. In all probability, a portion of it's going to remain vacant over time. And by the flexibility to allow for re-tenanting of some of that space with non-retail uses, as I mentioned, it does generate some sales tax. So it actually shows that you get a slight improvement in that condition with the higher non-retail limit of 45%. So if you look at those numbers, about 335,000 or 332,000 of lost sales tax, that's about a 10% reduction just of the shopping center sales tax revenue that the city gets today. But if you look at it as a percentage of all sales tax that the city gets, you're looking at about a 3% reduction. And we know in a city where there are fiscal concerns, I'm not downplaying or minimizing a 3% loss, but it's not as dramatic as you might expect from that big of a change in that policy percentage. Currently, your shopping centers overall have a vacancy rate of 9.6%. And varies quite a bit from place to place. Some are literally no vacancies, and some, like the marketplace, are quite high. We're showing that under either of these scenarios, we believe it's likely that vacancy rates would increase based on the assumptions we've made about potential losses of anchor tenants. And we know that in the case of the marketplace, that's not just a hypothetical, it's a pending event there. But that under the first scenario, the vacancy rate might go up to 16%, and under scenario two, about 14.8%. So in both cases, I would say higher than most communities and most shopping center owners would consider a healthy vacancy rate, but maybe not as disastrous as we see in some communities with much higher vacancy rates. At this point, I'd be glad to answer questions about anything I presented this evening. I believe you've also had a copy of our memorandum report, and glad to respond to any questions about that as well. So thank you very much for having me here this evening.
Stick around.
Sure will.
So commissioners, do you have questions right at this point? All right, go for it, Commissioner Ahmed.
Step back and not get lost. The purpose of this is to have sort of flexibility. So if there's a need for a non-retail space, that implement that, have a high percentage,
Well, our purpose is not really to make that decision. Our purpose is to provide some scenarios that help the city to understand what might happen to sales tax revenue primarily if you were to change that percentage. So that would be our recommendation. We know there are, and I believe city staff mentioned this in the first part of this presentation, there's a next step of how do we interpret this for purposes of rethinking that policy if that's the direction the city wants to go. We've primarily focused on what we understood to be one of the city's main concerns is the loss of sales tax revenue. And so we've made assumptions about how that might play out. I would say these are, in some ways, I would consider conservative assumptions because first of all, we've looked at pretty significant increase in vacancy rates. We've made conservative assumptions about what would happen to the sales of retail stores that remain within shopping centers. In other words, we know you're going to lose some retail tenants, restaurant tenants, so you lose sales tax that way. Some property owners would make the case that by having more flexibility with re-tenanting those vacancies, it actually enhances the performance of the remaining retail space. So you potentially can mitigate the loss by basically concentrating the retail sales in the remaining portion of the center that's retail restaurant. We haven't made any assumption about that. So it's possible you wouldn't have any sales tax decrease under these scenarios, but we've been fairly conservative in our assumptions.
So, let me just start with the city's guiding policy. Where we find this implementation policy is the guiding policy directs the city to have a mix of land uses to support, to create essentially a mix of land uses in the city to create a viable city. And then how we implement that is this policy of determining retail and non-retail balance. Traditionally, the city has used a percentage to be able to use that as what dictates the non-retail and retail balance. And our task has been to evaluate an alternative to the 25%. So we evaluated what that change from 25% to something else would be, because our city has a longstanding sort of track record of using a percentage to control non-retail and retail uses. But we've never been able to quantify what that impact by controlling 25% would be. And when we look back to why 25%, there really is no information in the record why we chose 25% to begin with. But, we have an opportunity here to amend the policy. One of the directions is taking a percentage-based approach, since that has been what the city has been doing. But I will tell you, all the other cities that we researched, there may be one city in all of California that actually designates a percentage of non-retail use maximum. And so we weren't able to just compare ourselves to, well, how is the percentage increase impacting other cities? There was no way for us to do that. And so the methodology that we came up with was, if one of the biggest concerns, and when we talked about adding the non-retail findings, and we had that whole discussion probably back in 2012, when we were looking at creating these findings, when we last did our comprehensive zoning code update, a lot of the findings point to vacancy rates, sales tax generation, how hard did a property owner go out to find businesses, how long has it been since that space has been vacant. So a lot of those findings were based on things that related to vacancy and then and what the potential impact to sales taxes. And so when we created this methodology for evaluation of the percentages, we looked at those sort of as the metric, right? How does a non-retail next to a retail use, how do those perform next to each other? And so that's how we use the Placer AI data to see what the relationship of people who visit non-retail to retail are. Then we looked at sales tax data, how much sales tax is being generated from the shopping center, and by increasing it, what does that do to the city's overall sales tax? And then we looked at vacancy rates. What does this mean in terms of if we continue with a 25% or go to 35 or 45%, how does that potentially impact vacancies? So we took a couple of different approaches to analyze the problem. And some of you may value sales tax as the most important factor in determining whether I go to 35, 45%. Others may look at it from a vacancy rate or the ability for a center to attract new tenants. That decision is up to you to make, but the only way to really quantify for this report was primarily focused on sales tax and what the impact to sales tax would be. And then also, tangentially, what that might mean to a shopping center if you were to continue to hold to a number that doesn't give them the flexibility that the center may need to be able to tenant spaces, to be able to maintain the viability of that shopping center. So I know that was a long answer to your question. So I'm fairly new to retail data. Roger, I'm sure, has a lot more background in that, but what we know just as consumers and as a city and data, what that shows us, pandemic made a huge impact to how people shop. It made people a lot more comfortable with using their phone and using things to order things and ship to their house. They kind of got used to the idea, I don't actually have to go out and visit a store anymore to get the items that I need. So, we know those things as just in general as consumers, but we're also we know things like 4,600 stores closed last year, retail stores closed in the country. We know that trend is going to continue. We know that bankruptcies of businesses are going up because retail centers are not performing as well as they did. So we have that type of information as far as trends, but it's difficult to predict what retail will look like post-pandemic. And it's just a different world of retail than it was even 2 years ago or 4 years ago, right? The ability for people to get their goods is so different than what it was when we had this 25%. I'm going to turn that over to the expert.
So traditionally, we would say that a very healthy shopping center would have a vacancy rate of 5% or less. If we look at all retail space in the community that's freestanding plus shopping centers, we would say 5 to 10% is still reasonable. So if you're under 10%, you're good, which San Ramon is. But those numbers are changing, and we would say that in the absence of strategies to reposition certain shopping centers, we would expect that number to get higher. I might mention that I've spent most of my career working on retail. It's kind of been a specialty of our firm and my own career I've been doing this for 36 years. And it's just kind of very visible that the retail world has gone through different eras over that period. And there was a time in our life when we were spending most of our time working for cities to identify what retail tenants they should be targeting to attract. And we would actually give them do an analysis and give them a list of names of stores to do. And we still do that to some extent, but that list is getting smaller and smaller. And most communities, when you talk about that type of a strategy, and then you talk to the property owners, the shopping center owners in those communities, there's a bit of a disconnect. They're talking about just trying to maintain what they've got. In some cases can backfill it with different types of uses. But in virtually every city we've worked in the last 10 years, when we're doing a citywide economic development plan, one of the top issues has been there are either a high vacancy rate shopping center or multiple high vacancy rate shopping centers that they're having requests from the owners to reposition it with other land uses. Mostly it's not as Cindy Yee mentioned, most cities don't have a percentage approach to it. So we're mostly dealing with places where they're trying to replace portions of a shopping center with housing or all of a shopping center. I know that's not what we're talking about this evening, but the point is that the trend is definitely towards a smaller footprint for retail commercial space. And in the absence of policies that allow for that, for flexibility on that, we have concerns about how that's going to play out in the community. And we suspect it would result over time in higher vacancy rates and less attractive maintenance of properties.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Commissioner Ahmed just on that one point?
But hang on one more
yeah.
second. Are you finished?
Yeah,
Go
I
for it.
thought he said it. His question on viable shopping center and percent, and then Cindy's comment that, and you said it also, San Ramon's the only city that, or one of many, very few that, have adopted this percentage. And then Cindy said the overarching goal is promote a mix of uses. And I'm guessing somehow there's probably a goal up there to make sure the shopping centers are nice and upkept and pretty full or whatever it is, and sales tax. So out of curiosity, what do you see most cities do to try and achieve I'm sure that everybody has sort of the similar goals, I would guess, provide a mix of uses, maximize sales tax, make sure centers are viable. So how do cities attempt to lead that way?
Well, we do see most shopping centers, they're just by market trends, the proportion of non-retail tenants is increasing, has increased over a number of years. That was accelerated, as Cindy mentioned, by the pandemic, but that trend was already in place well before the pandemic. So in most cities where there's not a percentage cap on those uses, that's just the way the market is evolving naturally. In some cases, as I mentioned, it's a question of taking a whole center or a portion of a center and introducing residential. And I know that in your housing element, there's consideration of that as well. So there are other reasons to do that. But basically, it's a mix of market trends being kind of in sync with market trends, which in some cases means significant land use changes. And we've focused in this analysis on sales tax because that's kind of we're number crunchers and that's kind of an easy metric for people to evaluate. But there's other things that are less quantifiable, but I think we would say just as important, dealing with just the community impact in terms of, as Cindy mentioned, viability of your land use mix. And that, I think that plays into this as well.
Did you have some other questions? Okay, Commissioner Curtis.
I'm sitting here listening to this and apologize for what's going to sound like a minor question. When we talk about the non-retail uses, I was sort of under the impression that if I use the concept of sales tax, that would be defining retail. But I think what I'm hearing you say is, so for example, for shopping centers have restaurants and sandwich places and eating establishments where you do pay sales tax, that those are not considered retail. Is that correct?
Did you say eating places?
Yeah.
Restaurants, I definitely consider retail.
Okay,
Because
okay,
that's
so-
definitely a
alright.
sales tax generating use.
All right, I feel better now. Thank you.
Yeah. And no, but it is confusing because the way different people in the industry refer to things differently, and restaurants, eating and beverage is sometimes talked about as if it's something different, but in my mind, it is a retail use and it's a sales tax generating use, sometimes very, very high sales tax generator. Maybe some of the examples we're thinking of, though, might be something like, and I'll defer to city staff to see how this falls within the city's policy, but from our perspective on the sales tax analysis, we would look at something like a yoga studio. We wouldn't consider that retail because that's not primarily what they do, but they do sell some apparel and yoga mats, et cetera. So they generate some sales tax. A movie theater, most of the space is not devoted to retail sales, but they sell some concessions, so they do generate some sales tax, not as much on a per square foot basis, but those are things that we would consider non-retail.
So question, when this policy was first created in who knows when, and the 25% came up, and now I look at this and 12 of the 21 shopping centers are already over that. Why do we even exist? Why do we even keep it as a 25% or a number at all? What's the rationale for even doing any type of percentage if other cities can be viable economically with growth and mixed use? Why do we feel like we need any type of percentage in the first place if we're not even holding true to it in majority of our shopping centers now?
So I can't answer why 25% was selected. That was 1986, really before my time here. And there's really no record as to why 25% was selected for that first general plan. But the policy was very specific in the general plan, and then that translated in the zoning ordinance to implement that 25%. And that's just been carried over time. And each shopping center that has made a request to exceed the 25% have all had to go through a permitting process. And we have to ask them a ton of questions about why you want to make this change. And a large majority of them have been able to make the case, especially for the smaller centers. When we talk about 25% of a 10,000 square foot shopping center, it's very difficult to not exceed 2,500 square feet in that shopping center, because that's from, like 2 or 3 tenants in that shopping center. So we've been able to make the findings to allow for those shopping centers to exceed especially on the smaller centers. Just by policy, we haven't really been as encouraging for shopping centers in the past when they've come up with, especially the larger centers come up in the past with a request to increase beyond 25%. We've really made them document and try to quantify as best they can why they need to exceed 25%. And so we've done a number of use permits to evaluate that, and some with more supports than others, depending on each center. But I can say that we have a percentage, and it's up to the city to decide if we want to continue to carry that percentage. Not a whole lot of cities do, but if that's where we feel comfortable with trying to be able to get to a comfort zone of having enough of control over non-retail uses, a percentage is one way to go about having that control. Um, so that's a control factor, but the potential downside is, as Roger mentioned, is that it doesn't build in flexibility to respond to market conditions. And so there are a number of different market conditions over these last 40 years that the city's been a city, that the invention of the internet, right? The invention of apps to be able to Amazon, businesses like Amazon that provide, and then the pandemic and all of these things that have changed the way that the market deals with retail. By having a percentage, it provides the city control, but it doesn't provide us that same flexibility to respond to the market. So it's up to the decision-making bodies to decide how much of a control that they'd like to have on the balance of uses. And so this is one policy. There's other tools that we also have in place to help with balances of non-retail and retail uses, but this is the one that impacts the centers the most, because once you exceed that 25%, then any business that wants to go in that triggers that non-retail use then has to stop any potential tendency from happening until they go through a potentially 6 or 8 week process with a resolution and findings to be made in order to allow for them to exceed that 25%. So there's some delay in the ability for centers to then market that space the way that they need to, but maybe the city feels strongly about having that control. So I'd leave that to the decision makers.
Through the chair, just one other point. The 25% has never really been quantified. There's been no information about how effective it's been in terms of maintaining sales tax revenue. And so this has been the first effort that I'm aware of that's ever tried to make a correlation between the percentage-based approach and the impact to sales tax revenue. And so, whether, the 25% came from the county before, or it was just an arbitrary number that seemed reasonable at the time, I can't say. But again, we just don't know. We didn't know back then that it was an effective standard. So,
Yeah, I guess my question really is, if going back to when the city manager presented the budget and so forth, where San Ramon sat in terms of comparison to the cities around us who don't have any type of percentage of retail versus non-retail, we weren't any better off. Matter of fact, we were slightly less profitable in terms of our retail sale or income than those cities around us. So I'm just trying to ask myself, why would we even continue down this path to think that we need to have something in place like that no other cities do, that are actually better off in terms of financial situations than we are, to even go down that path. So I just think it's kind of a thought that we would have to even consider. Why would we do it? Do we really feel like we're that much different and better than other cities that we have to put some kind of new policy in place that see if it catches on, like, a trend? Or we've done this since '86. Apparently it's not a trend, right? No other cities have really caught on to it. So another question I had is, I guess,
If other cities don't have a percentage, do you have any data how they control factor? Do you know how they control?
At least as far as my research, they don't attempt to control a balance of retail and non-retail uses. What they do, the tools that they do have are zoning. So traditionally identifying land use parcels, this is going to be retail, this is going to be residential. And they've used that as a tool to control how an increase in the amount of available retail areas to encourage retail uses. And we have that tool here as well, but we also have competing policies and goals as well. Most recently, the housing goal that does create a lot of impact to zoning and what things can traditionally be maintained as retail. We've tried to use that tool, the zoning ordinance, looking at strictly retail centers and as one way of creating additional opportunities for retail and reducing the pressure of residential impacts to those zones. But there are no other cities primarily use zoning parcels as their way of controlling how much retail is in their city.
So that leads me to the next question then is, given the fact that we're looking at a lot more mixed use in our city, I'm assuming this doesn't apply to mixed use as opposed to just retail shopping centers.
So the 25% non-retail, we would apply to shopping centers that are identified as mixed use. But as you'll recall, with our last general plan update, we made a huge effort to look specifically at, and I'll point to the 8 really the larger shopping centers, so over 50,000 square foot of ground floor space. Of those 8, we reevaluated whether or not the entire shopping center should be mixed use to give them the ability to convert some of that space to residential. And we use zoning as a tool to convert them, a large majority of them, back from mixed use to community commercial zoning. And community commercial zoning does not allow for residential uses. And so that was probably like step 1 of this policy of trying to create a balance of uses while also meeting all of our different policy objectives, is we put housing specifically on housing opportunity sites that we wanted to direct housing to. And then we pulled off residential on sites that we wanted to maintain the retail, the ability for those shopping centers to maintain and increase their retail. So while the 25% does apply to mixed use sites, those mixed use sites, it's almost a completely different sort of conversation about mixed use. So mixed use does allow for, also we set a percentage, but depending on if that mixed use is a housing opportunity site or not a housing opportunity site, then you have to follow the flow chart for whether or not this policy applies to them.
I have one last question. So in the modeling process says it included the acknowledgement of potential for future loss of anchor tenants in response to anticipated market trends. In that study, do we ever look at anything about the increase of rent that has happened around here, which is what actually has had a lot of our tenants and vacancies occur in terms of, future loss of anchor tenants?
We have not looked at rent.
So that is not a factor at all where we may actually end up losing, not because it goes from retail to non-retail, is because potentially it could be that rent's increasing and we're losing businesses just in that way, which is also one of the reasons we're losing sales tax as well.
That is correct. However, I think we would say that we would expect that the types of businesses that are generating the most sales tax can afford to pay market rate rents. And so, over time, we would expect rents to go up in sync with a healthy market. And uses that are not able to afford those rents over time we would typically see as lower sales tax generators. I know that's not true in every case, but that's generally what we see.
I'm just thinking of restaurants because I can think of at least 6 restaurants off the top of my head that have left because of rent increases in the last couple of years. And so those are those ones that are increasing, retail sales and things of that nature, but they're now being, moved out. And I don't know if it is cheaper for a cost of maintaining a non-retail space versus a retail space, if it's cheaper for the owner or the property. And so sometimes by masking the increase of rent to move certain industries out, it helps them in the long run as opposed to the viability of the city.
The honest answer is we haven't evaluated rent, so I can't really say more than that and speculate, but I guess we would generally make the assumption that the city's interests and the property owner's interests are, in the long run, are in sync, because you want policies that encourage reinvestment in properties and maximize the value of those assets, both to the owner and to the community in terms of the way that the property functions.
Yeah, unless the owner's looking to get out of that business and trying to sell the building itself, and you're right, they can get some vacancies.
But again, we would make the assumption if they're trying to do that, they would want to maximize the value of it. And so,
Potentially.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to mention that if you go back to 1986, 25% probably would have been such a high number at that point compared to what the market was. You didn't have that many cases where people were property owners were bumping up against that limit early on. And we used to assume that a shopping center would have maybe 10% non-retail use, just not because of any city restriction, just that's what the market was. You would have about 10%, and that varied by type of center. And that's, I guess, another issue with this type of policy is that it's less reasonable for certain types of centers to meet that standard than others. And historically, even back in those days, if you can think of a strip center, what used to be called a strip center, those would often be a lot of non-retail uses. They might have a convenience store or a restaurant would be a retail use, but then you had dry cleaners and laundromats and other things. And just the way they were set up, there was a higher percentage. But overall, we would say that probably you wouldn't expect it back in the 1980s, we would have expected maybe it was 15 to 20%. So that 25% number at the time probably was a high enough limit that no one thought it was going to be a constraint. But just as the market has evolved, we see more and more cases where that's problematic for a particular center.
Actually, I have one question for Lauren. Is there any conversation between cities and government about new ways that cities can actually increase their revenue with the lack of retail that's actually happening? So in terms of, as the retail market is shifting, you're going to have to think of a new way to have income for a city. Are there any conversations going on in terms of viability or possibilities of new ways for that type of income to come in place without relying on retail and non-retail spaces?
Well, I mean, there's the notion of taxing services as well as, like VAT tax concepts that are used in other countries. But that's something that is applied at a much broader level than a local level. I don't know, Cindy, do you have any thoughts on that one?
And I know there's been a lot of debate over internet sales and how those taxes come back to cities, and potentially as more and more cities are dealing with exiting of retail storefronts, that they'll reevaluate that question on how does that money get distributed back. And at least the way it was explained to me is that somebody who's purchasing an item on the internet, we don't get that full sales tax back to the city. We only get, it passes back to the county, and then there's a percentage, and depending on how much, retail uses and other things, there's factors, and then we get a percentage of that. So it's not a full return of retail sales back to the city. So potentially there may be that debate in the future, as far as we know, San Ramon residents do a lot of shopping, just not in the places that we want them to generate sales tax back to the city.
Before you get down, it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong. If Bob buys something through Amazon and Amazon collects $10 in sales tax, the sales tax is collected, goes to the county, goes to a pool. And what the county does is to distribute the pool to the cities in terms of what those cities report as basically a brick and mortar sales tax. So for example, a city like Pleasanton, which has much more in sales tax brick and mortar because they have hacienda crossings. Same thing with Dublin. They may have less online sales than we do, but they get a larger percentage of their online sales because they have a much higher percentage of sales tax brick and mortar than we do. And that's always been the problem. You've seen the charts, is that our neighbors to the south have assets that generate sales tax that we do not, specifically car sales in Dublin and Livermore, the big shopping centers such as Stonebridge, Hacienda Crossings, we don't have that. So when they talk about sales tax, the problem in San Ramon has to do with how it was developed. It was developed as a bedroom community out of nothing. And when they developed it, they did not plan for much in the way of retail sales tax generating. The prime example of that is Doherty Valley. That as a city by itself of like 44,000 people, they have one place in the entire Doherty Valley that generates sales tax, and that's the CVS, I think that Walgreens, that we permitted about 5 years ago over strenuous opposition from some people. So you have a city out there that develops no sales tax, but it has the expenses that the rest of us do, roads, taking out trees that tear up the sidewalks, things like that. So the only feasible way to equalize sort of stuff is to have a return to source of online sales. But that is probably a very tough sell up in Sacramento.
I asked the thing is, we need to start lobbying for viable if that was their dependence on to maintain their roads and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I know Senator Glazer had a bill that he introduced that would basically show what the results were, but I don't think it ever got out of committee. So that shows the opposition to doing stuff like that.
Okay, okay. So of course, we don't compete with Dublin and Pleasanton since they're Alameda County, and they get to compete with the Oaklands and all those places. But we do compete with Walnut Creek and Pleasant Hill and Concord and thus. 10 years ago, I joined EDAC and we were talking about this as a question. And one of the things that we had, and I'm sure things have changed since then, we do have an out for a shopping center developer to do essentially whatever they bring before the city. We do make it a little bit hard. I'd call it a speed bump, not a wall. And given some of the data, that we have pretty decent, occupancy rates or fairly low vacancies, and some of the centers have already gotten that permission, have kind of gone over that speed bump. How big a roadblock is it to the developers to go through the process that we have in place? Or I should say a process, maybe the findings that we have in place are a little onerous, but in the talking with the developers and things like that, do they want no rules, they want the Wild West and no rules apply, or what is the problem with our current policy? Maybe just to get that on the table.
You want me to start? Lack of certainty is a huge issue. And then of course the time it takes. You have a potential tenant that wants to come into a shopping center, and then they're faced with a land use process that's going to take 6 to 8 months, and the answer may be yes or no. And so why, unless the demographics and their proposal is such that they really want to stick around for that amount of time, or they can go find a shopping center where they can move in 2 months.
I think it's the analog of housing and objective design standards in my mind. They want certainty. Yeah. And then you also said something that intrigues me, and I'm going to guess that competing for retailers, given the shrinking market, is sort of a zero-sum game with other cities. If I'm a little store and I can go to city A versus city B, and city B has a process that's sort of uncertain and hard, I would pick city A, especially when we're or side by side with so many cities. And, it's not always clear when you leave San Ramon and go to Danville, or when we should know, but maybe others don't. They don't know where they're shopping. They just go to where the store is. And you did say that as far as other cities don't seem to have this fixation on a percentage that our city does. Is that true? Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. And I would say that looking at least in the Tri-Valley, and there are a lot of other successful cities with high retail bases. None of those cities that we research, at least comparing ourselves, because San Ramon is pretty comparable in terms of our population demographics with Dublin and Pleasanton and Livermore, and Walnut Creek too, to a certain degree. None of those cities, at least within our area, have any percentage-based regulation or any tools that they use. And then beyond just the Tri-Valley, there were there was one city that was pointed out to me that has a percentage where they apply it to a particular area within that city, not even citywide, where maybe it's a newer downtown or development type of area. That there was that example that was provided to us, but I haven't come across any percentage that other cities are using, and it just is something that we haven't been able to find another example, because the easiest way is to compare San Ramon to another city and say, hey, how does that percentage work for you? That would be the easiest way for us to analyze data. And that's kind of our first tool when we are looking at policy changes, is to say, how do we compare with another city? We couldn't find any of that data, and that's how we ended up on this path of doing this modeling. The other thing I know this isn't part of your question, but what really opened my eyes is with this study is that when you look at the taxable square footage, or the sales tax return per square footage, it didn't, I knew before that different types of uses generate a higher return of sales tax, but it made to see it on paper, to see eating and drinking establishments bringing in $420 per square foot as opposed to your traditional retail in that 200 square foot range, it starts to make a little bit more sense, right? A lot of people who live here tend to complain about not having enough places to eat and drink. And they're willing to drive 10, 15 minutes from their house to go get food. People are willing to drive to Livermore and Dublin and Pleasanton to go buy their TV or to buy their consumable goods, right? Because they're not using those on a daily basis, and they're willing to travel beyond city limits to be able to get those goods. So this study really identifies that if we wanted to perhaps focus on how to generate more sales tax, maybe looking at some opportunities to increase our attractiveness to eating and drinking establishments may be another consideration that we look at once we get beyond this, conversation about percentages.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would say to some of the questions in the comments, at least in the past, we're doing a macro analysis, but every store and every tenant and every business has a story about why they're there or not there. And, and I think that, I appreciate the big picture sort of look at it, but I also know, every tenant probably has a story about why they choose to be here versus not, and more importantly, when they leave, so it feels like a hard study. And then it feels like, we did get some public comment, of course, on this. And one of the recommendations was to, if I interpret it correctly from one of the retail centers, is greater percentages would be appreciated, but hand in hand, they really want the certainty of what it takes to go over whatever percentage we establish. If we leave it at 25, they want, to Lauren's point, very clear guidelines that, they know what they need to do, and then it's very clear, and whether it's hopefully not an onerous process, but it just still protects our sales tax revenue. I think my last comment, and it makes sense, and to me, the grand experiment of percentage may not be working, it just really feels that way. But it'd be really hard, in my own personal opinion, to abandon something that tries to protect retail, especially the optics of doing anything that could let retail sort of slip away, given what the city's facing and the presentations we've all heard about sales tax. It would be a hard story to say on the one hand, we have very low sales tax and we potentially could be asking to increase sales tax, but we're also reducing the base. And it feels like it's the right question, maybe the wrong time for that to be, advertised. And that's kind of just my gut sense. But based on my experience with EDAC and all the conversations we've had, and we've had this more than once, it does feel like the 25% or a percentage, maybe an experiment that has not really played out the way we originally hoped. So I think my final recommendation would be that we need to build certainty into the process. If we decide it's a percentage, which I have a feeling we probably will land on something, to build much greater certainty into the zoning, the findings we have to make, much like we need to create objective design standards for housing.
I'm going to take a little different tack than my colleagues. You have your report with you?
Yes.
I don't know, is yours numbered by pages of the report? We have a packet number, whichever works for you, I'll work with.
I just have my own report that's got its own page numbers on it. So
It has your numbers, but
Yes.
not ours?
that's right.
Okay. Next time you have to ask for our copy. On page 3 of your report, I have questions about the Placer AI analysis.
Mhm.
As I understand it, the first thing is you bought tracking data that shows Bob leaving from his home in Doherty Valley and coming to Crow Canyon Commons. That be an example?
Yes, but not quite. It doesn't track someone coming from their home. What we were looking at is what type of non-residential use they came from or went to. And the reason, first of all, that's the way they track it, but the reason that's of interest to us, we were trying to kind of simulate how a shopping center functions if non-retail uses like, let's say, fitness center, medical offices become part of that center. Are those types of uses now generating traffic for that center, even though they may not be in the center, they're coming from some other comparable use near it or outside the center? But generally what you're saying is correct. It tracks where someone comes to or goes to or comes from if it's another place and they consider a place either a commercial establishment, a workplace. The only residential type of thing that would be in there is like an apartment complex that has its own name that it's considered a place.
Okay, we don't have too many of those yet. On page 3 at the bottom, the sentence says, quote, "The table shows that center visitation to and from non-retail establishments represented about 1/3 of total visitations for all the centers." It's not clear to me, is the visitation, the 1/3 represents a visit to a non-retail establishment in a shopping center?
It's outside the shopping center.
Okay.
The way that system works, they don't track within a property different tenant types. So it's some other use. And again, we were using this as sort of a proxy for how it might work within a shopping center. But we actually looked at it on a map to see case by case, does this shopping center have a fitness center that's considered a separate place, but it's close enough by that we would expect it to somehow function as a synergistic tenant with it?
Would it be fair to say that the tracking data you have doesn't show what parts of the shopping center were visited?
You're correct, it does
Okay.
not.
All right.
Mhm.
Right. Now, I'd like you to take a look on your table 1A, which is, I don't know what your page is
I've
because
got table 1A, yes.
all right. The top is large centers. The first one is Shops at Bishop Ranch, basically 99,000 leasable square feet. the anchor tenant for grocery is about 32,000 square feet. Which grocery store is that?
I believe that's Sprouts, am I correct?
Whole Foods.
Whole Foods, I'm sorry.
Okay, got it. Okay, then the other major tenant, 24,000 square feet, is whom? No, it's not Target.
It's bigger.
Is that Home Goods?
Home Goods.
First of all,
Goods,
it might be
okay.
more than one tenant, that number
Okay.
is a total for tenants in that category.
Okay, okay. So here's my question. Am I correct that your square footage for leasing at shops at Bishop Ranch does not include Target?
I don't think that would, right?
It does not include Target because Target is technically not part of the shops at Bishop Ranch. They are owned, and the site itself is owned separately from the shops at Bishop Ranch and function as their own shopping standalone
Okay, what's that called?
Target. Just like,
And the reason I asked because Target doesn't show up in your list of shopping centers.
it does not, right? We only included centers that had three or more uses within that center. So, for example, Home Depot and Staples is really only two tenants. Anytime somebody would leave there would be leaving 100, plus thousand square foot space and leaving that vacant. It doesn't have the ability outright to re-tenant to multiple uses. And so for shopping center purposes, we looked at the centers that had multiple tenants within that center and identified those as shopping centers. So Target is its own standalone business if they were to go out. That we don't rely on Target's square footage to impact the non-retail uses at the shops at Bishop Ranch. So, because if you were to combine Target and Whole Foods together and created that as a super shopping center, you wouldn't reach the 25% non-retail because that large shopping retailer would never trigger that 25% because of how large that tenant is.
Right, and as an aside, I just have a real problem in segregating out Target when it's so close to the shops at Bishop Ranch and we're talking about shopping centers. I would think most people would consider Target part of the shops at Bishop Ranch, but so be it. Would you take a look at table 1B, which is the next table?
Yes, I've got it.
Okay. Again, on large centers, the marketplace, you have a total vacancy rate of 36.1%, which I believe you explained does not include either CVS or Firehouse 37.
It's included as if it were occupied now. So it's included in the denominator, but not in the part that's vacant.
That's right, I understand.
Mhm, mhm.
Now, what part, well, let me ask you this. Does the vacant part that you're counting for marketplace include what was part of Nob Hill?
Staff is saying no,
It's not there?
it's not.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Could you turn to table 4A, please?
Yes, got it.
So the first question I have, these are your assumptions that were built into your model.
That's correct.
The first one is threshold rate for quote excess vacancy, close quote, which is 5%. Now, if I understand this correctly, you basically have a baseline, no pun intended, vacancy factor of 5%. Anything above 5% would be termed excess.
That's right.
Okay, now where did the 5% come from?
I think as I mentioned earlier, that historically has been considered a equilibrium base vacancy rate for a shopping center. In other words, a shopping center would have that had a 5% vacancy rate. We wouldn't be concerned about that being a problematic for the shopping center, just kind of natural flexibility to have turnover of tenants, expansion of tenants, et cetera. But if it got above 5%, that would be, historically would be considered less feasible for a shopping center to maintain itself over time with a higher vacancy rate.
Now, my recollection, maybe I'm remembering what you said, but you said that currently the vacancy rate tends to be more between 5 and 10%.
Yes, but that would take into account space, like freestanding space that's not part of a shopping center. So if you think of an older community that has a corridor of a downtown area that's not really a shopping center, but just blocks of freestanding commercial space. In most communities, that has a higher vacancy rate. So if we factored that in, it would have, typically they would have a higher vacancy rate than the 5% without it being what we would consider abnormal.
Okay. The next line is anchor tenant loss factor. You have 50% applied to non-food anchors. Now, what was the basis for that figure?
It's really just an assumption. We looked at the individual centers, and the only one we have a specific knowledge of is the Marketplace, where the 2 tenants are going out. But we looked at the other tenants and said, if you lost 50% of the space, that would be a significant impact to the center. And we wanted to model what would happen if, in terms of reuse of that amount of space. In some cases, and again, we didn't try to do this center by center, because in some cases it wouldn't make sense to have 50% go out because there's only one anchor tenant. So it would kind of be an all or nothing, typically an all or nothing loss. But kind of applying that 50% across all the centers, we thought was a reasonable assumption to approximate what the future vacancies might be.
So I'm still not clear what your 50% number is based on. Is it some historical measurement of losing anchor tenants either in San Ramon or, across the country? I mean, why use 50 instead of, say, 35%?
It really isn't. It is just an assumption. I would say that it's probably conservative on average. In other words, the vacancy there probably would be fewer cases where 50% of the anchor tenants left than cases where they are. But we wanted to be conservative in terms of projecting sales tax losses. In other words, kind of more of a worst case scenario, what would the sales tax loss be? I should also mention that we didn't attempt to factor in any secondary vacancies. In other words, if a shopping center loses an anchor tenant, we would over time expect it to lose other tenants. We haven't factored that in, but so the 50% might be showing more than what would really happen for anchor tenants, but we figured that would also pick up some of that secondary loss as well.
If you reduce the anchor tenant loss factor, what would that do to your modeling in terms of the expected loss of sales tax revenue, which is what's driving this whole report?
It would show less sale. If it's a center that already has a low vacancy rate and you're not showing any future vacancy happening or less future vacancy happening, there would be less loss of sales tax revenue.
Okay. The next item down is maximum anchor tenant loss, 15,000 square feet. How is that figure derived?
Again, it's just an assumption, and it overrides that 50%. So if the 50% came out to be 18,000 square feet, we've set this so that it would only be 15,000.
Okay. Then the last line that we're talking about says Marketplace tenant loss set at 21,325 square feet. That's for CVS
That's
and
the actual square
Firehouse.
footage of those 2 tenants, right?
Okay, now the next block on your scenario 1 parameters, there it says reallocation of existing / future vacancies. Now, as I understand this, you basically say, let's take a round number. You're assuming a 10,000 square foot vacancy in a shopping center.
Mhm.
When it's relet, you're assuming that 15% of that 10,000 square feet goes to eating and drinking, 10% goes to other retail, 50% it goes to non-retail, and 25% remains vacant?
That's correct.
Okay. Where did these reallocation, what was the factual basis for these reallocations?
So again, we're trying to project for sales tax purposes what we would think is a worst case scenario. And for those purposes, the worst case is first and foremost, vacancies are the worst case. Second situation is non-retail uses. So we wanted to show a maximum amount of those types of things versus restaurant and other retail. I would also say that these percentages generally correspond to what we have been told by not just the developers we talked to in San Ramon, but in our work in other communities, that typically they're looking for non-retail tenants in this market to backfill vacancies, where they are perhaps most successful in recruiting retail tenants. It's in the restaurant category, and that's factored in here as one potential reuse scenario.
Okay. And then for the table 4A, basically what you're, the bottom line that I'm looking at is non-retail cap. That assumes that for a shopping center that you're looking at, what they do is they place a cap for non-retail lease space of 35%.
Right.
Okay. And then you have a similar calculation in scenario number 2, but you bump up the non-retail cap to 45%.
That's correct. So you probably figured this out, but the number up above that talks about reallocation of vacancies, and it says 50% would be non-retail. If in that particular center's case, and that's 50% just a vacant space, not the whole center. But if in that center's case, that 50% pushed the overall center over 35%, then things were readjusted. So you would not go over whatever the 35% or the 45% that we were evaluating.
Okay. In the parameters for either anchor tenant loss or maximum anchor tenant loss, is there a differentiation between the losses of retail space or non-retail space?
We assume all these were retail anchor tenants.
Okay. Now, table 4B.
Is generally the case for ground floor in most of the centers in San Ramon. You know, if I believe most of the anchor tenants that are on ground floor in shopping centers in San Ramon, we would classify as retail. If you look at City Center, it's got a movie theater, et cetera, second floor, but that's not part of this.
Right. And no, I understand that, but the way our shopping centers are set up, I think that all of them are only one story. So by definition, everything is ground floor space.
Right.
Table 4B is listed as unconstrained. Could you explain what that means?
So it's going to refer back to table 4A. We first reallocated everything based on those percentages: eating and drinking 15%, other retail 10%, occupied by a non-retail tenant 50%, and then vacant 25%. That is what we're calling unconstrained by that cap of 35% below. So we first calculate all the numbers based on those default assumptions. Then in cases for an individual center where that would result in a higher than 35% proportion of non-retail uses, it gets adjusted. And that's what happens in table 4C, which are the actual numbers that our calculations run off.
Well, yeah, 4C would be if you have a cap of 35%.
Right.
Non-retail. And then similarly, table 5C would be a 45% non-retail cap.
Correct.
Whereas in, I think it's table 4B, you have no caps. You just said, let the market decide what to do.
Yes, but it's just an interim step in our calculation. We kind of go to one set of assumptions. And then if you, for example, on table 4B, there is the Crow Canyon Commons under the future result of non-retail percentage is 36.3%. If you go to the next page, that's been adjusted down to 35%. So just a slight adjustment. Going back to table 4B, some of the centers were already below 35%, like
Right.
Shops at Bishop Branch was 22.7. It stays the same on the next page. So that's the difference between those two pages. It's
Right.
just adjusting it to come down to whatever we set that maximum policy at.
Right. And the thing that struck me, and you did mention it in your prior testimony, was that when you look at at least the large shopping centers, they tend to be either below the 25% cap or just right around the cap.
That's
That basically
correct.
correct.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
Right. Now, I don't know if this was part of your brief, but as Commissioner Alpert pointed out, we have a procedure in San Ramon whereby if a shopping center is anticipating entering into a lease arrangement with a tenant, a non-retail tenant that would bump up the share of the shopping center above the 25% non-retail cap.
Mhm.
There is a procedure whereby the shopping center can obtain relief from the cap, and I believe that you noted through cleverly placed asterisks that a number of the smaller shopping centers have applied for and received that type of relief.
That's
That-
correct. Mhm.
Okay, all right. Now you've been in the retail business for a few years. Do you see a qualitative difference in the types of retail, or let's say, let me back off a little bit from retail, a little broader category. Do you see a qualitative difference in the type of sales tax generating businesses in San Ramon as opposed to our localities like Dublin, Pleasanton, Livermore, albeit they're in another county? They're only 10 minutes away. Do you see a qualitative difference between the type of sales tax generating revenue we have in this city?
The most striking thing that came out of this to us was that 29% of your sales tax comes from shopping centers. If you looked at that kind of on a statewide basis, historically, it would have almost been the reverse. You'd assume that maybe 30% comes from non-retail uses and 70% comes from retail. And I know that there's shopping center and retail are not exactly the same thing because there's more retail. Shopping centers are retail, but there's more to it. So that's one feature that sticks out to us about San Ramon. The other thing that's an issue is that the types of shopping centers you have, we mentioned that your biggest sales tax generators on a per square foot basis are restaurants. Partly that's because your other centers are, with the exception of City Center, most of your centers are anchored by grocery stores. So a big portion of your footprint on retail is a grocery store or grocery stores, which are mostly not taxable. You know, if you go to a grocery store, about 25 to 30% of the sales are taxable, and the rest of it is not. So those two factors, the fact that you have a lot of non-retail uses altogether that are generating the majority of your sales tax, and then the fact that your shopping centers themselves are disproportionately occupied by lower sales tax uses, just not to say that they're not important parts of your community, but just by the nature of what a grocery store is, and that most of your centers are at the scale of what we would call neighborhood shopping centers that are anchored by grocery tenants. Those two factors, in our mind, kind of de-emphasize the importance of shopping centers. And again, I really don't want to make the point that we're dismissing the importance of this question that you're considering about this policy, but compared to other places, shopping centers are a less important source of sales tax than you might see in other communities of this size. Doesn't mean that this isn't an important thing to be concerned about, but it does give you some, I would say, a bit of additional flexibility about how you would think about protecting your sales tax base and growing it potentially.
Well, it would protect, it would deal with what you do with shopping centers, which, as you correctly pointed out, are really neighborhood serving as opposed to a regional or that type of shopping center. It's basically for local people to come in, get what they need done and leave. I mean, you've probably been to or seen a number of our shopping centers. It's, none of them are the place people tend to hang around a lot, are they? I mean, that's just a
Well,
fact.
that's historically has kind of been the nature of neighborhood shopping centers,
Yeah.
that they're a convenience shopping event.
Right.
I think what we see in communities that are, and this applies more to other types of centers, but I think it can apply to neighborhood centers as well, is that the centers that are most successful and most attractive in communities now are places that have intentionally made themselves destinations. And that all kind of boils down to mix of uses. And in our experience, that doesn't necessarily mean retail uses. It could be, a health club would be a non-retail use that could make a attractive anchor tenant or pseudo anchor tenant for a shopping center, or it could be classes, yoga classes.
Basically, it's a location where people go to and then hang around at,
Yes.
like city center.
Mhm, mhm.
Okay. The neighborhood shopping center that has 10,000 square feet probably doesn't fall into that category.
No, but there are examples of newer shopping centers that have been designed from the start to replicate that at a smaller scale. The community where I live in Southern California for years didn't have much retail. And finally, we have a town center that is, everyone just loves. They go there all the time. It's the place to go, but it's got a grocery store as the anchor tenant. It's got a movie theater and a few restaurants, but virtually everything else are non-retail uses, yoga, Pure Bar, Stretch Lab, those types of things that are there, but a very important part of why people go there and kind of consider it a community gathering place.
Yeah, there are advantages to having a clean sheet development because you could
Yeah.
take advantage of what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay. I have no further questions. Any of my colleagues? Okay, well, so before I let both of you leave, so we're at sort of stage one in our discussion. When I use discussion to mean your workflow.
It's, it is stage one as far as getting to modifying the zoning ordinance text. But we're also asking for some direction as far as, are we headed in the percentage route moving forward with text amendments? And if so, then we have to move into making findings to exceed that percentage. But like if we decide not to have a percentage, then we wouldn't have to move into step 2 to make findings. So we're asking for some direction as far as, are we moving forward with a percentage? Do you have an inclination of what that percentage would be? So that when we get to findings, because percentages and will apply to, right now it's set up as small centers have a different process than large centers. Once we go to a model where maybe the percentage is higher, the use permit process may change depending on where we settle with the percentage. So this dictates really the next steps that we take is, are we moving in the direction of a percentage and what that percentage is, so that then we can do step 2 and actually create the findings that one would have to make in order to allow it to exceed. That help?
Okay, so short version is you want some input from us now as to what our thoughts are in terms of a percentage at all, because I think I heard someone say jettison that, or B, do we keep what we have and rely on the process we have to grant relief in the appropriate spot, or C, bump up the percentage to 35, 45, or throw a dart against the wall and see what happens. I mean, that's sort of where we are.
Yes.
Okay. Now that I've rephrased the question, you have to provide some input because Cindy can't walk away from here tonight thinking, God, what are they thinking? So who wants to go? I see Commissioner Kuznick.
I've lit
All
up
right.
my light here, so thank
Alrighty.
you. So initially, in listening to this discussion about the percentage, I think we were all sort of started from the framework, well, we have a percentage, what's a good one? But in hearing the discussion tonight, I have a different viewpoint on this. I am leaning more towards jettison the percentage concept. And I want to explain how I'm getting to this statement. And that is one of the things we've heard here tonight over and over again is this need for flexibility. And I think we, as in our town, I know we're very protective of our local centers, and that has been really an important thing in terms of land use. But our disadvantage in this town is we don't have spaces to bring in other kinds of businesses that our surrounding community can. But what we could do going forward is offer greater flexibility. We can become the town that says, you know what? You're the shopping center folks. You figure out what works best and go for it. You know, we're behind you because that's in the best interest of our city. People will still need groceries. People will still need dry cleaners. People will still need places to get their pets groomed. But for the city to maintain this, like we know best, attitude, I think hasn't proven what we all thought it could be. So that's part of it. It's leaning more the free market, let the market decide about retail centers. I think it's been interesting that the percentage of our sales tax per square foot is restaurants. That has been something that can be encouraged and freed up, I think. So that is the direction that I'm leaning towards. And I also want to factor in as we're going forward and cities more and more are dealing with their own budgets and how they're allocating staff resources, to tie up our staff to sit through these 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 months, you know, come show me your homework. You know, why does your shopping center need a different percentage? It's not good use for you guys. You know, other cities use the land use permit center, you know, mechanism. So those are the two things that I'm leaning in this. So that is the direction that, since you asked for our opinion, that's the direction that I would like to offer.
Thank you. I didn't intend to come back up here, so through the chair, if I could just make one more point, because I know we did receive public comment and some questions about percentages and residential. And I wanted just to clarify that when we say non-retail uses, we're not actually saying replacing retail with residential. It's replacing we're replacing retail uses with non-retail, non-residential uses. So I just wanted to make that point because it seemed like some of the comments were alluding to that this change would then allow for residential to then increase, but it does not actually do that. This would only apply to non-retail, non-residential uses.
Right. What you're talking about is replacing a hardware store with a Pilates studio.
Correct.
Mr. Ahmed,
And I need the Pilates studio. I need to go work out more.
I'm sorry.
I need to go work out more, so it's good for us. You took the words out of my mouth. Free market. If the supply and demand, whatever the people want, let's just do that. I think you put a cap on it and have the government come and say, oh, you can't do this. Is, in my opinion, not the best use of resources and time. So I second or support your sentiments.
Okay. Let's go down at the other end of the table, Commissioner Alpert.
I don't think I can support no parameters at all. And the reason for that, and maybe it's not our domain to speak this way, it just doesn't seem rational to me that the city could be pursuing sales tax measures at the same time they're willingly allowing retail tenants that generate sales tax to go away. So I think my recommendation would be to, based on the evidence and based on this analysis, continue to maintain a percentage. And I think 35 and 45 are essentially the same number from an impact on sales tax coming through our retail centers. I could support either one, but I would want to couple that with looking at our process and our zoning language that allows for exceptions to be easier. So it's not completely a lawless Wild West on what can happen in the centers, but it does offer, I think, some flexibility.
Commissioner Curtis.
I agree with Commissioner Kuznick and Ahmed. I believe at this point, the exception is the rule as opposed to the exception, given the fact that 12 out of the 21 have already exceeded the 25%. So it has become the rule. I completely agree with Commissioner Alpert that you don't want the Wild West, but at the same point, vacancies, you're not necessarily saying you have to get rid of retail. What you're saying is you're allowing for those vacancy spots not necessarily to be subjugated to having to be retail. It allows them to be non-retail spots to fill in there, which then can create more reason for people to go to a Starbucks or whatever it is because they're leaving the gym, because everyone knows you have to go to the gym, then get your Starbucks, right? Because that's how it works. So I think at this point, it hasn't proven to be effective. There is no evidence that shows that the 25% cap had been effective, given the fact that we're one of the only cities that was able to be even found to have some type of cap. And show when you compare that to the cities around us having more profitability the way that they've been running, even if they have larger scale areas and so forth. City of Danville, or town of Danville, excuse me, doesn't have any type of auto dealers and things of that nature, but we have a lot of leakage just to that town next door to us because people go there because of what they can get there that they can't get here. And to me, I think a lot of it is we need to be thinking more rationally in terms of what we do in the city. And I would say instead of having people go over a process that takes 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it is, that we actually find some ways to start thinking about how we lobby to change the taxing so that we can actually be viable in the future, knowing that retail is really going to be a way of the past as opposed to the way of the future.
With respect to our friends to the north, 15% of their revenue comes from one place called Costco. So they're in a different situation than we are. That's the equivalent of having an auto dealer. Yeah. So, and it could have been in San Ramon, as some of the people here know. The problem of letting everything go into the hands of the developer, or that their motivation, not just primary, but their essential motivation, is to maximize revenue from their piece of property. And if they have a vacant space, they'll rent it to whoever they can rent it to. The problem from the city's standpoint is that that property demands city services. The streets that go up to it have to be paid for. The police have to provide security. So there's a lot of city services that are provided to shopping centers that, apart from property tax, most of which goes to the county, they don't provide support to the city. Now, the argument has always been that, well, these shopping centers provide services to the city. They allow people to go in and get their clothes cleaned. They allow to have their nails done. They are allowed to have a gym, although we don't have any gyms in shopping centers. So there are services that's the counterweight to, okay, we don't get any sales tax from it. But the thing that strikes me the most, which is why I belabored our friend, the consultant, over some of his charts, is this. The smaller shopping centers, most of them have relief from this 25% limit. And if you look at the vacancy rate, a lot of them are doing pretty well. What we're really talking about is the large centers. That's really what we're talking about, because that's where the sales tax revenue, I'm sure, comes from for the most part. The marketplace, to me, doesn't even belong on the chart, because that's going to be torn apart by the houses that are being built there. And it basically has, at least it seems to me from the last couple of years, has been left to sort of wallow in its, inferiority. I think it's a way station to being turned into housing. But if you look at the other shopping centers that are large shopping centers, they're all, as our consultant pointed out, either at or below, pretty close to the 25% cap. What does that mean? Well, if you look at low vacancy and they're at 25% non-retail, what it says to me is that the cap is not constraining their ability that much to rent their space. It's not hurting them, because otherwise they would have a lot higher vacancy rate. For example, Diablo Plaza, non-retail is 25%, the vacancy rate, 0. So the cap for the large centers does not seem to me to be proven to be a detriment to making that a viable shopping center. Our city council has made it clear repeatedly that they want whatever sales tax generating businesses to be kept in San Ramon. Now, we can't keep people here. They can always, leave with their feet. They can vote with their feet. And we have made efforts to keep them here. But I think there's a benefit to the city in requiring, as a quid pro quo, so to speak, for a developer getting city services to contribute something to the city other than a Pilates studio or nail place. I think that at this point, I don't see a compelling reason to jettison a cap. It seems to have worked well when we need to do it. And I've sat through, as I know Commissioner Alpert has, a couple of these times when a developer has come in and asked for relief from the cap. I don't recall, there may have been, I don't recall denying somebody that basis. One time, yeah. So it's been a relief valve. So as between throwing the baby out with the bathwater and taking the cap off, what I would suggest was more what Commissioner Alpert was talking about, is maintaining a cap, but raising it to trying to take into account in a reasonable basis different situations now than when the cap was originally imposed. I wasn't here in 1986, so I don't know how the 25% figure got picked. I don't know if it was done throwing a dart against a wall or someone said, gee, this sounds about right. But it seems to me from the data that we have just been given and gone over that it has worked reasonably well. And yes, there are some shopping center owners who want to have pretty much a free hand to put in whoever they want. And I can understand that's their right to feel that way. But again, as a city commission, we have an obligation to the city residents to try and preserve revenue streams, to maintain our streets, to hire the police officers and so forth. I don't see a compelling reason to throw out entirely the cap. If anything, I think a 35% cap, as Commissioner Alpert pointed out, is at this point in time a reasonable number to work on, bearing in mind that the city has the right to change that cap in the future if it becomes available through evidence that that type of cap is inordinately hurting commercial businesses in San Ramon to the point that they are becoming blighted. then we revisit that. And if we find that that cap, either A is too low or B serves no useful purpose, then what we do is recommend to the city council that they amend the zoning ordinance to do that. But again, I don't think at this point that jettisoning the cap entirely has been shown to be the best way to approach preserving retail sales tax revenue in San Ramon. So you've heard from all of us. I'm not sure that there's a consensus. I don't know if you want to ask us some more questions or arm wrestle between us or what.
No, I think I understand from each of the commissioners, each of your viewpoints as far as this work goes. And I did want to just respond in terms of the larger shopping centers and the existing vacancy rates and what that percentage is. At least in our interviews with shopping centers, and they own 4 of the larger shopping centers in the city. One of the comments that they did make about tenants that they've chosen is that because there is a cap in place in the city, that they have had to rent out spaces at a lower rate in order to fill that space so that it doesn't remain vacant. Because in their minds, having some rental income come in is better than letting it sit and trying to find the perfect tenant to go back into that space. So that is just one of the feedback points that were made to us, is that it may have a low vacancy rate on paper, but they may have had to, knowing that the city is conservative in allowing for larger centers to increase that percentage. And the findings are difficult to make. We ask for months of data to make sure that they've marketed and held out 6+ months before attempting to make a request, that in their minds, oftentimes signing a short-term lease or somewhat longer-term lease for a tenant to fill that space is better than keeping the shopping center vacant. So I just wanted to make that extra point as far as the vacancies, and on paper it may appear low, but there are different reasons why, and some of them may be because the center performs very well or the location of that center drives traffic. So we are not able to just apply the same apples to apples comparison of centers. So I just wanted to just make that one additional point because of the information that was coming from some of the shopping centers.
Thank you. Anybody want to add anything? All right, then this part of the hearing is over, meeting is over. The next part would be, we don't have any, okay. Do we have any liaison reports?
I do. The Architecture Review Board met last week and they had 2 projects. They had the Marketplace for the second time. They are proposing to replace the roof, do some exterior painting and trim, and clean up the clock tower. And the ARB reviewed the color palette and recommended that it move forward. The second project was a concept review for a Montessori school on a vacant piece of land. If you're driving up Faria Parkway and to your left are all the industrial buildings, and you go a little bit further before you get to the big water tower, there's a vacant strip of land essentially. And the applicant is proposing a Montessori school there. This was a concept reviews. They were just gathering feedback from the architects on what might look nice there, and no action was taken. There is no development application in front of them, but that was the ARB last week.
Mr. Kuznick.
So the Parks and Community Services Commission met last week. and had quite a robust agenda. They received the report from the Open Space Committee, and one of the things that really struck me were 2 points to that was that they're really working to increase their outreach and reaching out to people. And they're also really interested in reaching out and including the members of the Youth Commission as part of their open space committee to get more feedback from our younger citizens. So I thought that was really important. They also talked about updating Ramona Park. It's really quite old. The structures are all wood and not doing well, so they're replacing all those wooden structures. So there was a discussion on that one. The staff also updated or provided a review of their master plan, how they're doing on the Parks and Community Services master plan. One of the things that they spent quite a number of items on was emphasizing how well they're doing on their goal of inclusion and inclusive responses and all the different ways, which I thought was really interesting, and it was a source of quite a lot of pride for the staff. And then they talked about, they reviewed some events, they went through the operating budgets and where they're spending money, and they talked about what's happening at the Historical Society and the Performing Arts as coming events. So that is the summary of the Parks and Community Services meeting.
Mr. Ullman, okay. So last night I attended the Open Space Committee meeting. They are going to have a booth at the Art and Wind Festival out in front of the community center with pretty much adjacent to the other city bodies. I was hoping they'd do it next to the beer garden, but c'est la vie. They had a hike that was planned for 2 weekends ago, but if you recall, there was a lot of rain. Well, the hike didn't happen. They may try and kick it over to the fall. The largest part of our meeting was Seth Adams from Save Mount Diablo gave a presentation. The interesting thing was the Rorschach test showing where they started in terms of acquiring property in 1971 to where they are now. And their next big movement is going to be to try and go down the Diablo Range, which is the hills between the Bay and the Central Valley, all the way down from basically the southern part of Alameda County, all the way down to San Luis Obispo. Which is a huge amount of territory. Now, as Seth pointed out, one of the problems is that most of that property is privately owned. So there's obviously some challenges in acquiring easements and conservation easements and the like, but that's not going to stop them from trying. So, but they have done, according to the map, an incredible amount of acquisitions in Contra Costa and Alameda counties, not in the state park, but adjacent to it. They just acquired a property at the top of Finley Road that'll lead to Mount Diablo State Park. So they are very, very active in trying to preserve open space in this area. So that's my report. Mr. Barr, now it's your turn to tell us what's going on.
Well, the May 7th meeting will be canceled. We're looking at May 21st for potentially Avalon Bay project as well as CIP. We need to confirm that schedule with Avalon. We're still working through some design questions. We're also working on revisions to the objective standards, and we'll be coming back at a future meeting, 1 or 2 meetings out on that one.
Okay. Okay. So unless anybody else has some comments, thank you all for coming, and our meeting is adjourned.